Welcome to the audiobook of Erding, prequel novella in the War for Magic series by P.A. Mason. Chapter 1. "No way is she gonna eat that," Jennings said, his tinny voice resonating through my skull. I winced and adjusted my position against the cold stone wall, partly at the volume of my comms device which allowed our security team to communicate telepathically, but also with a sense of morbid fascination. Ambassador Benson's features gave nothing away, but with a plate of writhing grubs before her, for once I had to agree with Jennings. There was no amount of diplomacy that could force anyone to— "She's gonna eat it," Lewis piped in. My throat tightened as I watched the ambassador lift an oversized fork to skewer the live creature, and she didn't miss a damn beat as she stuffed it into her mouth while listening to a dwarf dignitary sitting at her side. Only a slight hitch of her throat gave anything about the taste away. "No, there's no way, man. These short-asses are playing games. I'll bet that's what they feed the dogs around here." I glanced at Jennings from my position at the side of the dwarven dining hall, and was glad the idiot's face wasn't betraying his words. There was a glitter in his eye, but that was standard for the wisecracking Adept Forces Officer, who I'd been surprised to learn had been assigned to the Azagrim security detail. Gross food aside, this trade deal with the dwarves was of global importance back home. The last thing we needed was someone like Jennings antagonizing our hosts. "We stick to MREs," I said, "and keep our eyes open. Levine didn't send you here to watch Benson eat. You should be keeping an eye on the guy next to her. Calm down, Peaches. We're going to be standing around watching this woman for months." I bristled at the patronizing tone, the same one I'd been dealing with since joining this all-male security detail, but kept my face neutral. "That's Officer Lopez to you, Jennings." A snort, which could have been Jennings or Lewis, answered the correction. I shifted on my feet. The comms devices had sounded useful when they'd been issued up on the surface camp, but having Jennings nattering inside my skull for the duration of these talks was less than appealing in retrospect. I noted that Benson hadn't pushed away her plate, even though she appeared to be chewing on something that looked more like a slice of mushroom. The dwarf next to her was supposed to be her counterpart for the peace talks, Dromender, I recalled, and seated farther along the table was our big brass interacting with royals from the far reaches of the Dwarengal realm. "Keep alert, guys. King Yarncrona is on the move." The latter was Gunther's voice in my head, and I glanced at the older AFO on the team. He stood alert, stationed across the room, and appeared zeroed in on the dwarf with a jeweled crown on his head to accompany the rings threaded through his silver-streaked black beard. The King of Kings, if I'd understood the briefing correctly. He took up a seat at the head of the hall next to General Rind, who rose to meet him with a firm handshake. I caught movement behind the king. One of his guards shifted position. The dwarf's dark eyes met mine with open hostility, his thick fingers wrapped around an ornate battle axe. Message received. I wasn't the only one watching for threats. Sliding my gaze across that side of the room, I counted the bodies who held onto their weapons openly. "Cut the chatter about the food," I said through the comms. "King's got at least 6 guards I can see, and they're watching us as closely as we're watching them." "Roger that," Gunther replied. "I count 8, actually. The 2 by the far archway are disguised as the king's personal servants, one carrying a cloak, the other his drinking horn." I scanned the room again, noting the servants Gunther mentioned. While they made a show of attending to the royal possessions, their attention was clearly on the room's occupants, rather than their supposed duties. I noted that a few of the other AFOs had positioned themselves nearby. The comms device had a broader band to open up a channel to all teams, but having tested it a few times with little response, I'd already decided that our comrades from Georgia were something of a closed system. We were just the interlopers from Fort Hood, Texas. Even with all 12 AFOs on stand-up duty for the feast, we'd be seriously outmatched if things went south. I was acutely aware that the minute we discharged the last shots from our blasters, we would be done for. We didn't have the advantage of magical abundance on Azagrim, and the fact that Earth had effectively taken it from worlds like this one meant the dwarves had every reason to hate us. "Look alive," Lewis cut in. "They're offering the general some of those crawlers." I watched as one of the dwarven hosts presented the same dish to General Rind that Ambassador Benson had choked down. The general's face remained impressively neutral as he held up a hand in polite refusal, reaching instead for what looked like a carved crystal goblet. "Oh shit," Jennings's voice crackled with barely contained laughter. "Watch his face when he takes that sip." Sure enough, as the general took a drink, his eyes widened. A muscle in his jaw twitched as he forced himself to swallow what I assumed was Durmouth, the notoriously potent dwarven liquor we'd been warned about. "Come on, guys," I warned as Lewis and Jennings shared what felt like mental snickers. But I had to admit, seeing the usually grim-faced general caught off guard was a little amusing. Still, I kept my attention on the room, particularly the servant who had drifted closer to my position. These dwarves weren't just hosts. They were sizing us up just as carefully as we were studying them. But the supposed servant only drifted by, and I caught sight of something glinting in his fist underneath the tray he held with the drinking horn balanced on top. He didn't get close to Benson or Colonel Monk, who were seated within range, so I loosened my stance and watched in my periphery as he made for the back of the hall. My eyes locked for a moment with AFO Samantha Ortiz, who was in that general vicinity, and her flickering gaze told me she knew what was incoming. As the evening wore on, I found myself cataloging the weaponry displayed around the vast hall. Ornate battle axes and broadswords hung between carved stone columns, their hilts inlaid with precious gems that caught the strange ambient light from above. Unlike the harsh fluorescent lighting back at Fort Hood, this illumination seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once, casting deep shadows in the hall's farthest reaches. Small figures darted through these shadows between the columns and beneath tables. Gnomes, I realized, skulking like they hoped nobody would notice them. Some cleared plates and filled goblets, while others appeared to be sweeping up whatever landed on the floor. A dwarf nobleman gestured impatiently for a drink refill, and a gnome hurried over with a pitcher. As it poured, I noticed its eyes weren't on its task, but on the dwarf's belt pouch. The nobleman caught the wandering gaze and shifted the pouch to his other side with a scowl. The gnome's expression remained neutral, but I recognized the calculated patience of someone waiting for a better opportunity. Another gnome slipped between two conversing officials, and I caught the quick, practiced motion of tiny fingers dipping into a pouch before retreating with something glinting between them. Our security briefings had mentioned gnomes as indigenous workers with known kleptomaniac tendencies, so I was at least grateful that some of the intel was proven correct. One gnome knelt to adjust something beneath a decorative grate where heat wafted up through vents in the floor. Some kind of geothermal system, I guessed. The whole setup reminded me of those fantasy movies I'd watched as a kid, except this wasn't some medieval great hall. Despite the traditional weapons and carved stone, there was something distinctly modern about the space. Clean lines, precision engineering. The contrast made me wonder how much the dwarves had relied on magic before the gates opened on Earth. Unlike the elves, who seemed to have built their entire civilization around magical energy, the dwarves appeared to have developed along both magical and technological lines. Maybe that's why they weren't as devastated when Earth drained their worlds. They'd had something to fall back on besides spells and enchantments. "Keep your eyes on the room, Lopez," I chided myself, forcing my attention back to security. But there wasn't much to watch out for, suspicious dwarf guards aside. And knowing that our team was on night duty following the feast, I took a jaunt within my zone to keep my feet from going to sleep. As an AFO, I didn't usually have much occasion for security jobs. It wasn't like our leaders were frequently off-world, and I was much more used to patrolling our new front lines on Earth. The very gates that had torn interdimensional rents all across the globe. That's not to say I would have preferred to be back in front of a gate waiting for an elven assault on home soil. But standing around for a few months eyeballing dwarves while people like Benson talked trade deals wasn't a thrilling proposition. "Looks like we're finishing up, people," Gunther said. "Or maybe it's time for a speech." the general and the king, front and center. I turned my attention to that end of the hall where King Yarnkrona and General Rind stood side by side. Then a gong sounded, and I stood a little straighter, waiting for what came next. I knew Rind and Colonel Monk were only here for the feast and would head back to Earth to let Benson do her work once things wrapped up for the night. So a speech was more than likely on the cards, and I figured they must have a large-scale translation device situated in the room somewhere, if the mass of dwarves were expected to understand the general. A high-pitched frequency ripping through my head confirmed that suspicion, and I tapped the controls on the comms device on my arm. Thankfully, it ceased, and I blinked a couple of times as I shared a look with Gunther, who likewise looked both stunned and annoyed as he fiddled with his sleeve. "Dwarves of Azagrim and humans of Earth," King Yarnkrona intoned, his audible dwarven words translated in real time inside my head. "This night marks change. For over a decade, dwarves have withstood the cataclysm which has robbed us of magical resources. We have been steadfast, resourceful, immovable like the stone in this very room. But the old ways fail us as magic fades from our realm. War cannot restore what was lost. We must forge a different path ahead and seek friendship with new allies committed to stability and trade. I introduce you to the human general, Richard Rind, who will offer assurances of this commitment." King Yarnkrona clapped General Rind on the shoulder. The general's face remained impassive. Standing side by side, I'd noted during the speech that the dwarf wasn't that much shorter than the general, who might have been around my height at 5'10". Rind's mouth quirked slightly as he offered a nod to the king before turning his attention out to the room. "King Yarnkrona speaks truth," General Rind said. "Earth's emergence onto the interdimensional stage has brought upheaval to many worlds. We acknowledge this, but where others chose conflict, your people chose wisdom. You adapted, survived, thrived. These are qualities Earth respects. We, too, have spent much of the past 15 years adapting to our new circumstances. And in that time, we have been under siege by elves, who blame us for what was clearly an act of God. Tonight, we offer our hand in friendship, and in time we'll strike a deal which brings magic back to the Dwarengal realm and delivers the resources we need on Earth to end the war with the elves. It is only then that we can truly turn our attention to longer-term solutions for the situation we find ourselves in, together, as allies and collaborators." I wasn't sure if the general expected applause, but if he did, then the silence that greeted his words must have felt pretty stark from where he was standing. I turned my attention to the more important dwarves sitting close to Benson and Monk, noting more than a few flinty expressions between them. The trade talks couldn't have been popular among all dwarves. Opening up a line of trade for lodestones filled with magic, which might have been theirs in the first place, was rough. "Fine talk, General," King Yarnkrona said, flashing his teeth in what was difficult to interpret as a smile owing to the bushy beard. "But there is a saying on Azagrim: words are wind, and promises are smoke. Dwarves judge worth through deed, not speech. If humans would be our allies, they must prove themselves as we do, shoulder to shoulder." My body tensed, and I first took in the slight widening of the general's eye before looking to Monk and Benson to see if this was going off script. What did the dwarf king expect? A wrestling match or something? But Monk's poker face gave nothing away, and Benson only leaned in with a polite smile. My eyes met Gunther's across the room for a moment, and I wondered if I should switch the comms device back on. When warriors would stand together, they must first prove themselves worthy of trust, King Yarnkrona continued. The Bordering agrees on this. This is why we have decided that while Ambassador Benson and Lord Dromander deliberate on talks of trade, we invite your soldiers into our ranks. To prove their mettle alongside dwarves preparing to face 3 Berghald trials, which will decide if they are to fall into step with the rest of our army. Those who succeed in these trials will earn a weapon forged for their hand alone, as is tradition. The collective silence in the room swelled, or maybe that was my heartbeat which was thumping, drowning out all other noise. He wanted us to do what now? I blinked up to meet Gunther's eye. His brows had drawn together in a slight frown. I mean, running a security detail was one thing, and there were plenty of things that could go wrong. But did the king just say that he wanted us to play gladiators or something? Tonight I call on Downtrodden Eldrialmer, Azogrim's finest swordsmaster, who has presided over the Berghald for many decades. King Yarnkrona held up an arm to wave toward the side of the hall, and a dwarf with a rust-red beard and burn scars on his left cheek made his way forward. He will admit those who are willing to face these tests into his arena, where they will train each day to prepare under his careful watch. I watched the swordsmaster approach the center of the hall with measured steps, his amber eyes sweeping across the assembled crowd. His swagger suggested that he was pleased by this little surprise, and I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from shifting on my feet. My fingers found the controls on my comms device, and I switched it back on, wincing at the immediate screech of interference. Static crackled as multiple voices tried to speak at once, but Captain Morales's clipped tones cut through. All teams stand by for instructions. The swordsmaster's voice carried across the hall, the translation flowing through my head with a high-end whine underpinning it. Those who would test their worth in the Berghald, step forward now. Show your kings and your commanders that you understand what it means to stand together. Several dwarven warriors moved forward immediately, their boots echoing against the stone floor. The swordsmaster waved for each one to step forward, producing what looked like metal bands from a pouch at his belt. The bands snapped around their wrists with a distinctive click that carried through the hushed chamber. My stomach churned as I waited for orders. This wasn't what any of us had signed up for. What the heck did those wristbands do? Was this some elaborate trap? I caught Gunther's eye across the room again, noting the tight set of his jaw. "What's the holdup?" Jennings's voice crackled through the comms. "No way I'm letting these short-asses strap some magic handcuffs on me." "How do we know they won't—" "Stand by," Morales cut in sharply. More dwarves stepped forward, and I watched as the swordsmaster continued fitting the bands with stern nods and handshakes. Each recipient stood a little straighter after receiving theirs, as if the metal itself carried some kind of weight beyond the physical. "All AFOs, listen up," Morales finally said. "Orders from Colonel Monk. We are to comply with all reasonable requests from our dwarven hosts. I repeat, you will step forward when called and accept the wristbands. Sir, with all due respect," Jennings started. "That's an order, Jennings." I shifted my weight, fighting the urge to object myself. The bands looked harmless, but anything magical on an alien world came with risks. We'd learned that lesson the hard way in the early days after the gates opened. "Soldiers of Earth," the Downtrodden called out, his scarred face turning toward our positions around the room. "Step forward now and prove your worth to stand with dwarven warriors." One by one, my fellow AFOs moved to form a line. I glimpsed Jennings's face as he fell in, his usual cockiness replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Lewis followed close behind him, then Gunther, his movements stiff but determined. I took my place toward the end of the line, hyper-aware of Ambassador Benson's calculating gaze from the table. Whatever game the dwarves were playing, our leadership had already decided we were going to cooperate. The swordsmaster worked his way down the line of AFOs, fitting each with a band. Up close, I could see intricate patterns carved into the metal, runes or writing of some kind, denoting something that we would come to understand only after they'd been fitted. The dwarf's movements were precise, almost ceremonial, as he fitted each band with a sharp snap. When he reached me, those amber eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me want to step back. But I held my ground, keeping my face neutral as I had through countless tense situations before. This close, the burn scars on his face told a story of survival, someone who'd faced fire and come through stronger. "Your hand," he said in heavily accented English, surprising me by not relying on the translation device. I extended my right arm, watching as he positioned the band. His fingers were thick but surprisingly deft as they manipulated the metal. For a moment, nothing happened, and then the band snapped shut with a click that seemed to reverberate through my bones. A sensation like ice water ran up my arm, followed by a warmth that settled into my skin. The dwarf's eyes met mine again, and I could have sworn I saw something like smug satisfaction in their depths before he moved on to the next AFO in line. I flexed my fingers, testing the band's fit. It felt snug, but not uncomfortable, and whatever magic it contained seemed content to simply hum quietly against my skin. As I lowered my arm, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just signed up for far more than a simple security detail. Chapter 2. The weighted practice axe swept toward my ankles with enough force to shatter bone. Instead of leaping backward like every human combat instinct screamed at me to do, I sank deeper into the Hron Krona stance, right foot forward with toes spread, left heel anchored at the precise angle marked in chalk on the stone floor. Root to stone. Breathe in. Core tight. Durgan's eyes gleamed with the certainty of victory as his weapon whistled through the air. But instead of dodging, I rotated my planted foot a quarter turn inward, dropped my center of gravity, and felt the strange sensation of the floor's energy traveling up through my legs. The axe blade passed within a hair's breadth of my boot. In the split second of Durgan's overextension, I pivoted on my anchor point and snapped forward with a short, explosive strike to his exposed ribs, just as our instructor Jormund had demonstrated time and time again. A surprised grunt escaped the blue-bearded dwarf as he staggered sideways. I remained perfectly balanced, my body humming with the strange connection to the stone beneath. Holy crap, I'm still standing. After a month of bruises and frustrated curses, I'd finally executed the stone anchor properly. Even Durgan's stunned expression couldn't hide the reluctant respect in his eyes. Being paired up with dwarves for training hadn't made things easier. Most of the bruises I'd earned from the stouter race might have been less purple if I'd had an AFO to spar with instead. I was about to spare a glance up at the gallery where Benson would be seated with her counterpart, Dromondor, as they observed the training each morning before the first meal of the day. More to see if Morales had noticed from his position watching her back while we trained. But then the gong sounded, announcing the end of the training hour. We all stepped back, placed our weapons on the sandy floor, and bowed low to our partners. Hrokker Sten, Jormund, our training master, intoned from his raised platform in the middle of the arena, which echoed as honor to the stone in my mind thanks to the translation device. Hrokker Sten, I said in time with my training companions. Straightening, I knuckled my lower back and gave Durgan a companionable nod. He only snorted and turned his attention to a female dwarf by the name of Thordis, who'd been Gunther's training partner for this session. Look at them, he scoffed, uncaring that his audible words in Dwarven were delivered in English to anyone who was close enough to hear him distinctly. They can barely manage the most basic of forms and expect praise for their efforts. It will be a wonder if they can make it past the first trial. Thordis hooted with laughter, and I exchanged a glance with Gunther. The look on his face suggested he hadn't yet mastered the stone anchor. It was mostly the same each day from the dwarves, though Durgan and Thordis were slightly more exuberant in their scorn. I fell into step beside Gunther as we left the arena so I wouldn't be stuck with Jennings or Lewis, who were, frustratingly, faring better than most of the AFOs committed to these trials. Another day done, huh? I bumped his shoulder. You going straight up to the surface? Gunther had a tendency to fall behind as he gawked at the so-called marvels that Asagrim had to offer in their underground city. I, on the other hand, couldn't wait to journey up to see the sun every morning as we finished our long shift of watching the door to Benson's apartments overnight, with little to report, and even less to do. But the AFO shrugged, slipped his glasses on, and exhaled wearily. Hitting the hay sounds good. I pursed my lips and glanced over my shoulder to see the day shift team make their way up to Benson. The ambassador was standing now, clearly waiting to get on with her own business, and those scheduled for the afternoon shift ventured beyond the arena out to the city proper. That left Lewis and Jennings chatting with each other, and I decided to beeline it for the dwarven equivalent of an elevator, so at least the ride to the surface would be free of their yammering. Besides, I felt like Gunther could use a little pep talk. I think they're right, you know. The dwarves. This is all for show. Don't get overly worried about these trials. Gunther snorted in answer. You and I both know that's BS. It would be just as difficult for them as it would be for us if a brouhaha got in the middle of the trade talks. These people need lodestones, and a couple of AFOs who don't get the hang of swords aren't going to get between them and a steady supply of magic. At least I hoped as much. Yeah, well, as AFOs, we're supposed to be the pick of the bunch. Elite soldiers. He squared his shoulders as we made our way through stone hallways adjacent to the palace, but not open to the general public. If I'd known swords were part of the detail, I would have volunteered to be bait outside a hostile gate. Come on, you're not doing that bad. I lengthened my stride to keep up with him. And you are an elite soldier. Ask anyone who owes their life to you thanks to a magical shield thrown up just in time during an attack. Shields? It's not like that'll do us any good in close quarters combat. His tone was dismissive, but not defeated. He drew to a stop by a carved opening in the wall and pulled a lever to call the cage, which stopped at various levels of the underground city and went right up to the very top. He craned his head to get a look at the gadgetry inside, an interested cast to his features suggesting he would have preferred a technical challenge rather than an offensive one. You'll be fine. I folded my arms and leaned against the wall. As I hear it, the first trial has nothing to do with fighting at all. They're just going to load us up with stuff and make us race to some underground cavern. An underground cavern crawling with all kinds of hostile off-world creatures. His lip curled. Captain Morales didn't say it would be easy. The success rate is fairly mediocre, even for dwarves. I snorted, but my mind drifted to some of the larger haunches the dwarves served with dinner. They reminded me of gigantic shellfish. Is that any different from the alien monsters who come swinging swords through the portals back home? Those ones I can shoot with a blaster from a distance, Gunther said. Never said I wasn't a good shot. And that he was. As we waited for our ride, I bit my lip, wondering what else I could say to cheer the guy up. But I didn't want to sound like I was blowing smoke up his ass, so I left it and hoped a little shut-eye would brighten his mood. And maybe after we pulled through the first trial, he'd feel a little better. I was prepared to make it my business for everyone in the team to make it through, even Jennings. The ride up was quiet, and I stifled a few yawns as the cage hurtled us skyward for long after any normal elevator would have completed its journey. The conveyance finally ground to a halt, and we emerged into the harsh light of Azagrim's triple suns. I paused, tilting my face up to let the warmth seep into my skin after hours in the cool underground chambers. No matter how many times I made this trip, that first breath of surface air felt like freedom. The landscape stretched out before us in waves of rust-colored dirt and sparse vegetation. A few twisted trees dotted the plains, their branches gnarled from perpetually battling the fierce winds that swept across the open terrain. It was beautiful in its own stark way, though I understood why the dwarves preferred their elaborate underground cities. The deeper you go, the more important it gets, I'd learned during my first week here. The dwarves considered the surface barely worth noting, a necessary evil where they stationed minimal security and basic infrastructure. All the real politics, commerce, and culture happened in the depths where the stone purportedly sang with ancient magic. A flash of movement caught my eye near a cluster of stunted trees, and I fought back a smile. Right on schedule. Come on, I said to Gunther, gesturing toward the massive geodesic dome that housed the surface camp. Before we cook out here. The dome's specialized magical materials filtered out the worst of the solar radiation while maintaining a bearable temperature inside. As we passed through the airlock, the familiar buzz of human activity washed over us. This was where the real administrative machine behind the trade negotiations churned away. Communications specialists hunched over arrays of equipment, trade analysts pored over reports, and medical staff monitored environmental readings. Major Harrington stood at his usual post near the command center, somehow managing to look crisp and alert despite the early hour. He gave us a brief nod as we passed, his attention already returning to the screen in front of him. "I'm gonna grab some rack time," Gunther mumbled, already heading toward the sleeping quarters sectioned off at the back of the dome. "Sure thing. I'm thinking breakfast first." I watched him shuffle off, then made my way to the mess area. The automated dispensers offered a variety of MREs. Not exactly gourmet dining, but better than what was served in the dwarven dining hall. I selected a breakfast pack and found a quiet corner to wait while it heated. The bustling camp provided excellent cover. Everyone was too focused on their own tasks to pay attention to one tired AFO grabbing a bite to eat. When the heating cycle finished, I gathered my tray and casually headed toward one of the side exits. The security protocols were a lot looser up here. The dwarves considered the surface too inhospitable for any real threats, and the human command was more focused on protecting the delegation below ground. Still, I made sure no one was watching before I slipped outside. The gnome was waiting for me in the shade of the twisted trees, her small form nearly invisible against the reddish bark. Gotha's weather-beaten face crinkled into a smile as I approached. "Malmsinn," she said softly, her voice carrying despite the wind. It translated into a dwarven greeting through my comms device, which I parroted back to her. I'd never told anyone about these clandestine meetings where Gotha taught me dwarven. "Watch your gear around those little ones," Major Harrington had warned during our first briefing. "They'll strip a pack clean before you notice they're there." The casual disdain in his voice had struck me as odd at the time, but I'd since witnessed the smaller race making off with whatever was unguarded around the edges of the surface camp. The brass would probably have a fit if they knew I was sneaking off to learn from a gnome whom they considered an inferior alien race. But despite all the translation devices in Azagrim, I had an itch to figure out how to communicate directly. To understand how the dwarves ticked, maybe. Particularly when some comments, perhaps more closely related to an urban dictionary, refused to translate through the comms, much to the amusement of the more colorful characters I'd encountered. Gotha beckoned me deeper into the copse of trees, the twisted trunks providing cover from casual observation. I followed, balancing my breakfast tray carefully as we proceeded to the hidden spot where she conducted our lessons. A scrap of sun-bleached canvas was tied to the tree trunks to provide shade, and a simple work table, which resembled a human-sized coffee table, sat underneath, littered with tools and gadgets. "How training is?" she asked brightly as she sat cross-legged in front of the table. I opted for a flat rock and balanced my breakfast tray on my knees before answering. "How is training?" I corrected. "Finally managed the stone anchor form." Take time, but do. This is good." Gnomes on Azagrim lived much closer to the surface than dwarves, in what reminded me more of burrows than caves. Gotha had agreed to teach me dwarven in exchange for mastery of the English language, which she'd somehow managed to pick up before I'd arrived. If things were bad for dwarves without magic, they were dire for gnomes who were only middling in magical aptitude. She never told me directly that she planned to visit or migrate to Earth, but I couldn't see any other reason she would care about our language. "Well, I'm not sure how it will be much help with the first trial, but maybe I'll be able to at least defend myself when we get to the other two." The gnome chittered in what I understood was laughter and took up her tools to focus on the terry mess in front of her. Our meetings usually followed a pattern where I ate, and she tinkered. When I asked what she was working on, she'd only told me that it was a gift and that it would be finished by the time I departed the dwarven homeworld. "Dwarves like talk. Talk, talk, talk. It will be long before talking done, yes?" She made a face as she scraped her tar into a ball. "Well, I mean, it's already been a month." "Pah. Only long for induction?" I frowned. "Introduction?" "Yes, introduction. Much talk, follow." I puffed out my cheeks and took a bite of my flavorless meal. Why did it feel like Gotha had a better grip on the negotiations than the entire human diplomatic team put together? It wasn't like I got much intel on the overnight crew. Almost certainly by design by Colonel Monk, who wanted to keep his ship tight. And there had been no briefings that I'd been privy to, which suggested Benson was making progress. Are you saying I'll have enough time to become a swordsmaster? Maybe not. I snickered at that, imagining myself stuck here for years, only to become frail with age and never meeting the lofty swordsmanship standards of the longer-lived race. But at least training made things a little more interesting, if also challenging. I had to remind myself that I would be frustrated in a worse way if I was only standing guard, sleeping and eating while I was stationed here. Have you had a chance to talk to your people about what this thing is yet? I lifted my arm to indicate the wristband, which remained fixed to me since the feast. It had been the reason I'd first sought to befriend the gnome, but despite being a talented enchanter among her people, she still couldn't discern the device's purpose. Neither had anyone in our human team. Gnomes not know all dwarf secrets. She paused to snatch something skittering across her workbench, examine it briefly, then pop it into her mouth with a satisfying crunch. This ceremony, yes, but maybe we'll decide if humans and dwarves succeed in trials themselves, or maybe no. I tried my best not to let my features betray revulsion at the casual air of insect consumption. There had been plenty of theories about the bans, ranging from trackers, clandestine recorders, biometric monitors, or maybe some kind of ticking time bomb. But despite having confirmed that there was some kind of magic about them, they hadn't done anything hinky that I'd noticed, and they certainly didn't look any different from the ones our dwarven teammates wore. Well, I'm guessing Firehelm won't be following us into the cavern to check up on us. I took a sip of water. The Brockerdrotten had earned the moniker on account of his actual name being too hard to pronounce, and how the term was translated over our comms device. Us AFOs had also whispered about whether he'd earned the name on account of the burn marks on his face. Did you figure out anything else about this first trial? You want help is cheating, the gnome complained. Trial is trial. Deep underground where gnomes not welcome. Test stamina and strength. You spend more time practice and not thinking. I rolled my eyes and continued my meal. What wasn't fair was that the other dwarves preparing for the trials seemed to make it a full-time job. Beyond the training hour itself, they devoted much of the day working out in whatever gym equivalent existed on Azagrim, while we were stationed on doors losing the combat fitness we'd arrived with. But sleep was also important, and the scant hours I spent with Gotha were the only real rec time I got in any 24-hour time period. Gathering information is not cheating. The gnome lifted her head to make rare eye contact. Dwarves know gnomes help and be trouble. Nobody knows I'm here. I pursed my lips, wondering at what kind of trouble Gotha and her people usually endured from dwarves. Did the lodestones help? Gotha's lined face turned upward in a smile. Ah, yes. Ormshire Daler tribe much grateful. Old pump system for growing caves work again now. She patted the terry substance she'd been working with. Without magic, water not reach highest tunnels where we grow food. Many moons, children hungry. What she described made it sound like the dwarves had been perfectly content to let the gnomes starve because of magic shortages. The small pouch of lodestone charges we used in our blasters, which I'd smuggled out each week, seemed a minor infraction in comparison. Crystals you bring we crush and mix with sevja, sap from above trees, make engine work again, food grow. She reached beneath her workbench and withdrew a small leather pouch that clinked softly as she pushed it toward me. We make gift, for trials, for thanks. But you just said, I began. Trial must be fair, she interrupted with a dismissive wave. But trial must also be possible. Dwarves breathe different, live underground many generations. Humans not same. She tapped her chest. Not cheating to make equal chance. What is it? I opened the drawstring to reveal several small stones with faint blue markings. for when air grows thin. Dwarves not tell humans everything about deep places. Some tunnels have skerdluft, false air. She made a choking gesture. When breathing hard, crush between fingers. Blue dust make good air bubble. I carefully tucked the pouch into my pocket, feeling its weight against my thigh. Thank you. Gotha nodded solemnly. Now, time for lesson. Repeat after me. Brand Ganger. As I stumbled through the harsh consonants of elementary dwarven phrases, my mind kept returning to those blue-marked stones. What other dangers awaited in the depths that our dwarven allies hadn't bothered to mention? 1 month of training had taught me enough to execute a stone anchor, but the real test waited in the darkness below, where all our surface world instincts would work against us, and apparently where the very air itself might become our enemy. Chapter 3. 3 months of training has crystallized into this very moment, Brokerdrotten Firehelm announced from his place on the dais in front of a cavernous opening, even deeper than the palace itself. You have prepared for this moment, and you will now be tested. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, studying Ambassador Benson and Colonel Monk where they stood behind Firehelm. The colonel's usually impassive face bore the faintest hints of concern, with a slight furrow between his brows and a tightness around his mouth. But Benson maintained that same sanguine composure she'd shown since eating cave grubs at the opening feast, her silver-streaked hair perfectly coiffed despite the humidity in the cavern. My gaze drifted to my fellow AFOs lined up beside me. 3 months of brutal training under the dwarves had transformed us all. Lean frames now whipcord tight, softness replaced with hardened muscle. My own uniform hung looser despite the increased mass, and we all moved with a newfound economy, a predatory grace born from endless weapons drills, and nothing but MREs to sustain us. I could only hope it would be enough for whatever these caves would throw at us. Firehelm's voice boomed off the cavern walls as he raised his arms dramatically. Deep beneath us lie the ancient tunnels of our ancestors. Within them, you will find tokens left by my finest warriors. His eyes gleamed in the torchlight. Return with 3 tokens apiece before the sands in this glass run empty, and you will have proven yourselves worthy. He gestured to a dwarf bearing an ornate hourglass, its crimson sand catching the light like drops of blood. Another stepped forward with modified rebreathers, sleek brass and copper constructions with leather straps. The air grows thin in the deep places, Firehelm explained as the devices were distributed. These will help you breathe. Do not remove them, no matter what you hear or think you see. That last part sent a chill down my spine. I secured the breathing apparatus, testing the seal, the metal cool against my skin, each breath carrying a faint metallic taste, then hefted the unsurprisingly heavy pack onto my shoulders. Around me, fellow AFOs adjusted straps and checked gear, all of us preparing for whatever waited below. My hand brushed against the small pouch where I'd stashed Gotha's blue stones. I'd spent many nights debating whether to use them or not. Could they really mean the difference between life and death in the depths? But as I watched my fellow AFOs adjust their gear, faces tense with the same uncertainty I felt, something shifted inside me. The gnome had proven more trustworthy than our briefings had suggested, and right now, we needed every advantage I could get. I caught Kelly's eye first, passing him a stone with a subtle gesture and whispering quick instructions about crushing it when the air grew too thin. Hayes was next, then Patel. Each of them tucked the blue crystals away without comment. We'd all learned to accept help where we could find it. But when I got to Jennings, I hesitated. He'd been nothing but a pain in my ass for 3 months, with his constant attempts at flirting and his inability to take anything seriously. Still, leaving him without backup felt wrong. With a silent sigh, I slipped him the last stone. His eyebrows shot up, but for once he kept his mouth shut. Firehelm paced before us, boots scraping against stone. The torchlight cast dramatic shadows across his scarred features as he assessed us, measuring our readiness for whatever trials awaited below. The tunnel mouth gaped behind him like a wound in the earth. Unlike the carefully carved passages of the upper city, this opening was raw, the wilderness of the underground. Thick shadows pooled beyond the reach of the torches, and a cool draft carried hints of age and decay. "Positions!" Jormund barked, and we lined up at the threshold. My heart hammered against my ribs, though I kept my expression neutral. "Yo, how long we got in regular time?" Jennings called out, breaking protocol as usual. "These sand timers ain't exactly standard issue." Jormund's tattooed head reflected the torchlight as he turned. "3 of your Earth hours," he growled even telepathically. "Though I suspect you'll find time moves differently in the deep places." That earned chortles from the dwarves lined up, who I suspected knew a lot more about what waited for us down there. 3 tokens didn't sound like a do-or-die situation, but if it came down to it, would we be facing off against them to scramble for each one? The instant Jormund gave the signal, we scattered like startled rats. I caught Gunther's eye and jerked my head toward a side passage. He nodded, falling into step beside me as we broke away from the main group. Behind us, I heard Jennings' voice echoing off the walls as he led a charge straight down the central tunnel. Typical. "Smart move," Gunther muttered through his mask as we jogged. "Let them burn themselves out early." The tunnel system sprawled like a spider's web with offshoots and intersections every few yards. "There must be hundreds of these," I said, marking another dead end with chalk after our second backtrack. "The tokens could be anywhere." After 40 minutes, nearly a quarter of our allotted time, we'd covered significant ground, but found nothing. The heat built steadily from uncomfortable to genuinely oppressive, with steam wafting from cracks in the ground. My uniform was soaked through as we squeezed through an increasingly narrow passage. We emerged into a wider chamber to find Kelly and Patel struggling, both red-faced and panting. Kelly waved off my concern, gesturing vaguely at a partially collapsed tunnel ahead. We left them to recover, but their condition was telling. If one of our strongest climbers was struggling this early, what awaited us deeper below? At the 1-hour mark, the air changed. It became thinner, carrying an acrid taste that made my throat burn. I activated my breathing apparatus, hearing Gunther do the same beside me. The device whirred softly, filtering the air through whatever dwarven tech they'd built into it. "This is just the start, isn't it?" Gunther's voice was muffled behind his mask. "They wouldn't give us these unless it gets worse." He was right. I remembered Firehelm's warning about not removing the masks, no matter what you hear or think you see. The thought made my skin crawl despite the heat. We pressed deeper, following a passage that spiraled steadily downward. The heat continued to build, and even with the mask, each breath felt labored. The air had a strange quality now, heavy and thick, like trying to breathe underwater. I knew that lava played a part in some of the dwarven mechanics in the city, and I worried about what that meant if we slipped into the dark somewhere. A distant scream echoed through the tunnels, followed by what sounded like retching. I exchanged glances with Gunther. The masks weren't just for show. Something down here was affecting the others. "How much time do you think we have left?" Gunther asked, pausing to wipe sweat from his forehead. The gesture left a streak of grime across his face. I checked my watch, though time felt distorted in the depths. "Maybe 2 hours?" Assuming Jormund wasn't lying about time moving differently down here. The passage ahead narrowed again, but this time the walls seemed to pulse with heat. My breathing apparatus wheezed slightly with each inhalation, and I noticed Gunther's doing the same. The dwarven technology was impressive, but I was starting to wonder if it had limits we were about to discover. "You feel that?" Gunther asked suddenly, pressing his hand against the wall. "Like a vibration?" I laid my palm against the hot stone. There was definitely something. A low thrumming that seemed to come from deep within the rock itself. It reminded me of standing next to massive machinery, feeling the power contained within. "Maybe we should..." I started to suggest turning back, but a flash of light caught my eye. Something glinted in a crevice ahead. Something metallic and out of place among the raw stone. "Token?" Gunther asked, already moving forward. I grabbed his arm. "Wait." The vibration was stronger now, and my breathing apparatus made an ominous clicking sound. Something's not right. As if in response, a deep rumble shook the passage, and the air grew noticeably thinner despite our masks. The heat pressed in like a physical force, and my heart raced as my body fought for oxygen. "These masks," Gunther wheezed. "They're not going to cut it much longer, are they?" I shook my head, trying to ignore how the edges of my vision seemed to be darkening. "I think we're about to find out exactly what Firehelm meant about the deep places." I pulled the blue stone from my pouch and held it up, watching it catch what little light our headlamps afforded. Gunther mirrored my action, his face barely visible behind his struggling rebreather. "On 3, I wheezed. He nodded. 1, 2, 3. We crushed the stones simultaneously. The effect was immediate and startling. The crystals burst into fine powder that seemed to dance in the air around us, creating a bubble of breathability that pushed back against the oppressive heat and thin atmosphere. My next breath came easier, and I saw Gunther's shoulders relax. "Gotha, you beautiful genius," I muttered, moving forward with renewed confidence. The token we'd spotted earlier gleamed more clearly now, a small metal disc wedged into a natural shelf in the rock face. I stretched up on my toes to grab it, fingers closing around the warm metal. The dwarven runes etched into its surface pulsed with a faint blue light. "1 down," Gunther said, his voice stronger now that the stone's magic was working. "How the heck are we supposed to get 6? A commotion from a connecting tunnel drew our attention. 2 dwarven warriors emerged, moving fast despite their stocky builds. Each clutched several tokens, but their faces showed strain even through their specialized breathing gear. They barely spared us a glance as they rushed for what I hoped was the exit. "If they're bugging out..." Gunther left the thought unfinished. We continued, following a tunnel spiraling sharply down. The gnomish magic held, creating a protective bubble around us, but I could feel the malevolent pressure of the deep places pushing against it. More figures passed us heading upward, Kelly supporting a barely conscious Haze. Then a trio of human soldiers I couldn't identify with the masks gripped their prize as they hauled ass upward. The second token appeared almost by accident. I spotted a glint of metal in what looked like a natural chimney above us, barely visible in the gloom. Gunther gave me a boost, and I snagged it with my fingertips. As I dropped back down, the ground shuddered ominously. "That's not good," Gunther muttered, and then everything went sideways. The tremor caught us off guard. Gunther stumbled, his boot catching in a crevice as the floor buckled. His cry of pain ripped through me, even over the rumbling of the earth. He went down hard, face contorted in agony. "Shit!" he gasped, clutching his ankle. "Shit! Shit! Shit!" I dropped to my knees beside him, hands hovering uncertainly. "How bad?" He tried to rotate the joint and turned even paler. "Bad enough. You should go on ahead. We've got maybe an hour and 40 minutes left, and you still need 1 more token." I glanced up the passage we'd been following, then back at Gunther. The smart play would be to leave him. He was right. Time was running out. Dragging him along would slow me down considerably, but I couldn't just run off. "Like hell I'm leaving you here," I said, already pulling his arm across my shoulders. "Up you get, soldier." "Asha, don't be stupid." "Shut up and hop." I got him vertical, ignoring his grunt of pain. "We've got 2 tokens. We find you 1 more and get you back up there." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it when he saw my expression. "You're the most stubborn person I've ever met. You know that?" "So I've been told." I adjusted my grip on his belt. "Now come on, 1 foot in front of the other, and if you make any jokes about this being a 3-legged race, I will drop you." We started our slow ascent, with Gunther limping awkwardly and me taking as much of his weight as I could manage. The gnomish magic continued to protect us, but I could feel it weakening. Whatever powered those stones wouldn't last forever. "Hey, Lopez," Gunther said after we'd covered about 50 feet of tunnel. "Yeah? Thanks for not leaving me down here." I grunted, readjusting my grip. "Yeah, well, paperwork's a bitch if I lose you in a dwarven cave system. Easier to just drag your sorry ass out." He chuckled, then winced as his ankle knocked against the wall. "Sure, that's definitely the reason." We continued our awkward three-legged shuffle upward, marking our path with chalk and hoping we were heading in the right direction. The sounds of other teams echoed distantly through the stone, and we encountered our next token glinting from inside a crevice in the wall. That was 3. And when we almost fell over Jennings and Lewis at an intersection with a fistful of tokens, I handed my charge over to them with the 3 we'd collected. "Shit, what happened?" Lewis ducked to take my place, propping Gunther up. "Fell during a tremor," Gunther grunted. "Jesus, Peaches, you've only got 3? Jennings groaned at me. His voice was wheezy, and I didn't have the energy to pull him up on the so-called pet name he insisted on using to address me. "Yeah, and you're taking him to the top while I go get my 3. I said it like I was confident that would happen, but in truth, I didn't know whether it was a fool's errand. "Here." Jennings pulled a token from his pocket and pressed it into my hand. "Found an extra. Take it." I stared at him, surprised by the unexpected gesture. "Thanks. I didn't think—" "Yeah, well," he cut me off, uncomfortable with the moment. "Consider us even for that blue rock thing. Now go get your tokens before time runs out." I nodded with a grudging respect for the guy I'd chalked up as nothing but annoying. "Get Gunther to safety. I'll make it." I'd already turned and taken a side passage downward as Jennings went to argue. I slid on my backside down a steep tunnel that angled even deeper into the earth. The rock was strangely smooth here, and my descent quickly became less controlled than I'd planned. Heat pressed in against the weakening protection of Gotha's first stone, so I pulled out my last one and crushed it. The magical powder created another bubble of breathability around me just as I shot out of the tunnel into open space. I landed with an undignified thump on something unexpectedly soft. The beam from my headlamp revealed a cavern floor covered in thick, spongy lichen that glowed faintly blue where I'd disturbed it. My heart rate spiked. This didn't look like part of the trial tunnels. This looked like something's home. Scanning the cavern, I spotted a gleam of metal in one corner. No, multiple gleams. There was a whole pile of tokens scattered there, at least 24 of them. But something about their placement made my skin crawl. This wasn't a collection point for the trial. This was a hoard. An ominous clicking sound echoed from somewhere in the darkness beyond my light's reach. I lunged for the tokens, scooping up as many as I could and shoving them into my pockets. The clicking grew louder, accompanied by a scraping sound that reminded me of knife blades being dragged across stone. I bolted for a dark opening on the far side of the cavern, not caring where it led as long as it was away from those noises. The passage twisted upward, and I took it, then another ascending tunnel, and another. My legs burned from the steep climbs, but the clicking followed, growing closer despite my pace. The beam of my headlamp bounced wildly off the walls as I sprinted, creating disorienting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. My breathing came in ragged gasps that the mask struggled to filter. The tokens clinked together in my pockets with each step, broadcasting my location to whatever was pursuing me. I skidded around a corner and nearly slammed into a wall. Dead end. No, not quite. Above me, a shaft stretched upward, disappearing into darkness. I could make out enough handholds to climb it, but it would be tight. The clicking grew louder, closer. I jammed my boot into a crack and hauled myself up, searching frantically for the next hold. The shaft was barely wide enough for me to shimmy up, and the rock was slick with condensation. My fingers found purchase on a tiny ledge, and I pulled myself higher. Something moved underneath me. My headlamp illuminated what looked like a mass of clicking mandibles and segmented claws reaching upward. I kicked out instinctively, dislodging a shower of loose rock that clattered down onto the creature. Its angry screech followed me up as I climbed faster than I'd ever climbed before. My hand found the top edge just as something scraped against my boot. I hauled myself over with a desperate surge of strength and rolled away from the opening, gasping. I was back in the main tunnel system. After catching my breath, I pushed to my feet and started moving again, though at a less frantic pace. The tokens weighed heavy in my pockets as I followed the paths upward toward the entrance. My lungs felt like they were on fire despite the mask, and my legs trembled with exhaustion. I burst out of the tunnel mouth and collapsed at Firehelm's feet just as the last grains of sand were trickling through the hourglass. Everyone else was already there, looking worn and wheezy. Even the dwarven warriors showed signs of respiratory distress, though they tried to hide it. Colonel Monk shot me an annoyed look, probably for cutting it so close, but Ambassador Benson was beaming. I pulled off my mask with shaking hands and gulped in the relatively fresh air of the upper caverns. Then I started pulling tokens from my pockets, creating a small pile of gleaming metal at Firehelm's feet. I didn't have time to count them, I wheezed, still trying to catch my breath. But you might want to send someone to clean out that lichen cavern. Your tokens have attracted some interesting local wildlife. Firehelm studied the pile of gleaming metal, his expression unreadable as he nudged it with his boot. Hoarding treasure serves no purpose if you arrive too late to claim victory, he rumbled. The sand nearly emptied before your return, human. I remained silent, too exhausted to defend myself. Did he know I'd helped Gunther? Did he care? I hadn't expected praise for doing what any decent soldier would do, but his dismissal of my efforts still stung. His expression shifted to something between challenge and amusement as he addressed the group. The Depths trial tests more than your ability to navigate our realm. It reveals who you are when the earth itself becomes your enemy. Rest while you can. Each of you will now progress to the Echo trial. Chapter 4. I believe he inviting you into mineral pools for pleasure times. Gotha grinned toothily as she wrapped strands of metal around what she described as a velamir. She paused in her work to scratch behind her ear, examined whatever she'd found there with interest, then popped it in her mouth with a satisfied hum. My cheeks warmed and I cleared my throat, trying not to think too hard about what she'd just eaten. I wasn't wholly surprised, as the comms device had translated most of what the strapping dwarf who I stood at least eye to eye with had said to me, but even still, I was glad I hadn't accidentally accepted his proposal, mostly on account of the pools in question resembling a slimy swamp. Thought as much, I said tightly, then stood. Thank you for today's lesson. Any wise words to share before I hit the hay? Gotha frowned, likely at the idiom, and she paused in her work to fix her eyes on me. The Ormar Daller tribe wish to know if talking is success? I bit my lip, unsurprised by the question. Gotha's people had to be concerned about what the trade deal meant for them, and once we'd finished up, I wouldn't be able to supply them with what little lodestones I could. But the fact was that I had little to share about the diplomatic situation. I'm just a soldier. It's not my business to know what they're talking about, but from what I can tell, they're making progress. I folded my hands into my armpits. Can't your people try to make a deal of your own with Earth? It sounds like the dwarves aren't going to be overly eager to share with you guys. Gotha shook her head, her shoulders tense. King Jarnkrona talks for all on Azagrim. Our Gordsprek talks for gnomes to dwarves. Is the way of our people? I shrugged, not knowing quite what to say to the gnome who'd grown on me over the past months. In truth, Earth's diplomats probably wouldn't trust dealing directly with gnomes anyway, given their reputation. I could only hope that Benson was in there doing her best to not only trade lodestones for weapons tech and alloys, but to collectively figure out a plan to close the gates between our worlds. It was the only way folks like Gotha would climb their way out of the magically devoid hole they were in. I said my farewells to the gnome and headed back toward the surface camp, my boots crunching on the volcanic gravel. The morning air was thin but clean, a stark contrast to the mineral-heavy atmosphere underground. My lungs appreciated these daily escapes, even if I had to lie about them. As I approached the airlock, I spotted Reed and Captain Morales through the transparent sections, hunched over a stack of papers. Reed's perpetually loosened tie swung as he gestured at something. The rest of my team and the afternoon crew, Patel, O'Malley, Kelly, and Ramirez, were scattered around the common area, an unusual sight this early. The airlock cycled, and I stepped inside, grateful for the cool air on my face. Morales's head snapped up. "Lopez," he barked. "Out for a walk, were we?" I smiled and batted away a flash of annoyance. I was hoping he was too immersed in whatever he was looking at to notice my arrival. The fresh air helps clear my head. "Better check your equipment hasn't sprouted legs while you were smelling the roses. Damn gnomes have made off with a good amount of the last supply crate that got left outside too long." His mouth twisted with distaste, and he gestured for everyone to gather around the central table beside Major Harrington. "We've received intelligence suggesting the next trial will be held soon." The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Hayes, who'd been with us during the first trial, was back on Earth now. His lungs hadn't recovered from whatever they'd exposed us to underground. The replacement, Eastwood, who had been excused from the rest of the trials on account of not being part of the first, shifted uncomfortably. "Okay, soldiers, here's what we know." Reed tugged at his tie as he spoke. "This time, we believe it will take place in complete darkness. We're working on countermeasures to offset the dwarves' natural advantage in low-light conditions." "Great," O'Malley muttered, "because the last trial went so well." Morales shot her a warning look. "Pick up your attitude. Maintaining positive relations is crucial. Like it or not, that means your performance in these games has consequences back home. You're AFOs. You should know better than anyone that we need this deal to give us an edge against the elves, to help us finish the war and make the deaths of all those who went before us mean something." I caught Reed studying me, and I knew he was thinking about the blue stones which had saved our collective asses in the first trial. After being quizzed about them, I'd fumbled through an explanation about a dwarf with a crush, but I could tell he and the captain didn't believe me. The truth about Gotha would have raised too many questions about my unauthorized interactions with the locals. "The talks are progressing," Reed emphasized, his tie swaying as he leaned forward. "The dwarves will outfit us with the materials we need for advanced weaponry once this is done, but we need to maintain trust. That means taking part in their traditions, including these trials." "Even if those traditions land us in medical?" Patel asked, rubbing his chest. Like most of us who'd been there for the first trial, he still experienced occasional breathing problems. "Even then," Morales said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "Ambassador Benson is making significant headway. We can't afford setbacks now." I stayed quiet, thinking about what Gotha had told me about her people's situation. The gnomes were caught between Earth's desperation for weapons tech and the dwarves' iron grip on power. I wondered if Benson knew or cared about these political undercurrents. "We'll keep everyone in the loop when we know more. I'll also get word to the morning team. You're excused, soldiers." The last came out in that drill sergeant voice Morales was accustomed to using, and Reed gathered his folder from the table before rushing off. I was about to slink off when Morales caught my sleeve. "Lopez, a word?" I approached his desk as the others dispersed, their murmured conversations carrying an edge of anxiety. Morales waited until we had some privacy before speaking. "You don't seem worried about the next trial," he said, shuffling papers without looking at them. "Given your performance in the first one, I'd expect more interest." I kept my expression neutral. "Just processing, sir. Like everyone else." "Right. And that crush of yours? The one who gave you those stones?" "Haven't seen him since," I lied smoothly, though my heart rate picked up. "Probably for the best, given the circumstances. The captain held my gaze for a long moment before nodding. Huh. You'll let me know if he cozies up to you again, and if he gives you anything before handing them out to the team. You had no idea what those rocks did. I still say you could have gotten everyone killed. Dismissed. Lopez. As I walked away, I could feel his eyes on my back. He hadn't been giving me a hard time exactly, but it wasn't the first time I'd copped an ear lashing about not clearing Gotha's gifts before distributing them. I'd have to be more careful about my morning meetings with Gotha. Things were going to get antsy for a while. After drawing back the curtain to the bunks at the back of the dome, I let out a deep breath as I kicked off my boots. A trial in complete darkness? That was unsettling enough. But if it had anything to do with the monster I'd encountered in the lichen cave, which I'd learned was called a Grunvarger on Azagrim, I thought we might have a chance of sending more than one AFO home afterward. I just hoped it wasn't in a body bag. I wiped sweat from my brow as I watched Gunther execute a perfect defensive barrier, except it was with magic and not his sword, which he'd failed to bring up in time to deflect the attack from Durgan, our blue-bearded dwarf counterpart who enjoyed giving us a hard time. I winced and then tried to cover it as Gunther looked up to meet my eye. Again, Firehelm called from his perch above the arena, voice carrying clear authority. Next to him stood Grimir, an elderly master craftsman. His milky right eye and sharp left tracked every move we made with unsettling precision. His white beard, woven with tiny gemstones, caught the light as he shifted. From the observer's gallery above, I glimpsed Ambassador Benson's silver-streaked dark hair as she leaned forward, her attention fixed on our training session with unnerving intensity. Reed hovered at her shoulder, tablet in hand as always, while Captain Morales stood at parade rest behind them, his eyes narrowed as he assessed our performance. Lord Dromender sat beside Benson, his gemstone rings catching the light each time he gestured during what appeared to be a whispered conversation with the ambassador. The barrier dissolved and Gunther dropped to one knee, trying to mask a wheeze that I recognized all too well. The sound transported me back to the day before when we'd caught some sleep. I'd lain awake listening to him hack and cough in his bunk despite the healer's best efforts. The first trial had left its mark on all of us, but Gunther seemed to be taking longer to bounce back. Maybe on account of his body having to deal with the busted ankle at the same time. I trotted over with a cup of water to buy Gunther at least a moment to get his breathing under control. "You've got this, soldier. Durgan doesn't wait for Yorman to signal. Don't bother waiting for permission." Gunther gulped the water and nodded tersely, and I retreated with the cup, hoping that, for once, my comrade would get a lucky break. I watched as Durgan's muscles tensed, that telltale sign I'd observed since they started sparring. Just as I'd predicted, the dwarf launched forward a heartbeat before Jorman's hand dropped. This time, Gunther was ready. My teammate slid across the sand in a controlled drop, bringing his sword up in a swift arc. The blade met Durgan's attack with a resounding clash that echoed through the training arena. The dwarf's eyes widened in surprise as his momentum carried him past where Gunther should have been standing. I sagged against the arena wall, unable to contain my grin. Finally. After watching Durgan pummel Gunther for what felt like hours, it was deeply satisfying to see his face mottled red with defeat. Defensive magic might have been Gunther's forte, but he'd just proven he could meet steel with steel. Above us, I caught Firehelm watching with what might have been approval, fingers absently stroking one of the ceremonial rings in his beard. Even Grimir leaned forward slightly, his penetrating gaze never wavering. But it was the flash of respect in Yorman's eyes that meant the most, however brief it might have been. In the gallery, Ambassador Benson and Reed exchanged a glance that I couldn't quite interpret. Morales had his arms crossed now, and I recognized the subtle nod he gave. The closest thing to approval I'd ever seen from him. Only Dromender seemed completely unimpressed, absently twisting one of his many rings as he consulted a scroll that his aide had just delivered. Jennings pushed off from his position, lounging against the far wall, his usual cocky grin plastered across his face. He sauntered over with his sword resting on his shoulder, apparently unable to let Gunther have his moment. "Well, would you look at that?" he drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Finally managed to use your sword instead of hiding behind those big-ass magic bubbles of yours. Maybe there's hope for you yet." My jaw clenched. The last thing we needed was Jennings running his mouth, especially in front of the dwarves. I stepped forward, heat rising in my chest. "Shut your damn mouth, Jennings." A hearty laugh cut through the tension. Grimir tottered forward, his stooped frame and halting steps making my heart leap each time he seemed about to fall. Yet the ancient dwarf navigated the stone steps with surprising sureness, moving faster than his apparent frailty suggested possible. "Young warrior," he called to Jennings, his milky right eye catching the light, "you speak as one who believes victory lies only in the strike. But tell me, what good is a dead hero compared to a living soldier?" Jennings shifted uncomfortably under the elder's gaze. "I just meant the ability to keep a blade from your throat, by whatever means necessary, is as vital as knowing where to place your own." Grimir's voice carried authority despite its weathered tone. "And a well-balanced team? That is worth more than 1,000 lone warriors swinging their swords." I watched the exchange carefully, still wondering why someone of Grimir's status was suddenly interested in our training. Surely he had better things to do in his workshop. As if sensing my thoughts, Grimir turned and tottered past me. The knowing smile he gave me sent a chill down my spine, and in that same moment, the wristband fire helm had snapped on months ago grew warm against my skin. I resisted the urge to touch it, keeping my expression neutral even as questions multiplied in my mind. Jennings, for once, had nothing to say. He retreated to his wall, leaving Gunther to prepare for another round with Durgan. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Grimir's presence meant more than any of us realized. I watched Grimir's retreating form, still unsettled by that knowing look and the heat against my skin, when Jormund's sharp whistle cut through the arena. The sound echoed off the stone walls, drawing everyone's attention. "Gather round," he barked, his gold teeth glinting as he spoke. "Your training is about to get interesting." A woman stepped out from the shadows behind him. She was shorter than me, and almost petite by dwarf standards. Dark hair hung in braids woven with metal beads, which clinked softly as she walked. What caught my attention most was the intricate tattoos covering her forearms. They looked like maps of cave systems, though I couldn't be sure from this distance. "This is Frida Bergfetter," Jormund announced. "She will take over your combat training for the next phase." I noticed a flurry of activity in the observers' gallery. Reed was tapping furiously on his tablet while Benson leaned toward Dromander, their conversation appearing more animated than usual. Morales had stepped forward to the railing, his attention completely focused on Frida. Reed already had the intel, so I wondered what had caught them by surprise. Frida's eyes swept over our group, lingering briefly on each face. When her gaze met mine, I noticed a hardness there that spoke of someone intimately familiar with violence. She was missing her left pinky finger, and she made no attempt to hide it. "You've all performed adequately in standard combat," she said, her accent thicker than Jormund's. "But now we prepare you for something else entirely." She reached into a pouch at her belt and pulled out a handful of black cloth strips. "From this moment forward, all combat training will be conducted blindfolded." "You're joking," Jennings blurted. Several dwarves, including Durgan, snickered at his outburst. Frida's expression didn't change. 3 weeks, every session, no exceptions. She began distributing the blindfolds. In the deep places, sight is a luxury we cannot always afford. My stomach dropped as I accepted the strip of fabric. 3 weeks of blindfolded training could only mean one thing. The next trial would be soon. I thought about the Grunvarger I'd encountered in the lichen cave, how my headlamp had been the only source of light in the creature's den. Was that what we'd be facing? "This is bullshit," Jennings muttered under his breath as he tied his blindfold. "How are we supposed to fight what we can't see?" That's precisely what you'll learn, Frida answered, her hearing apparently sharper than we'd assumed. The stone speaks to those who know how to listen and use all of their senses. I glanced at Gunther, who was examining his blindfold with interest rather than dread. Trust him to approach this like an academic exercise. Patel, on the other hand, looked like he might be sick. Partner up, Frida commanded. We begin with basic movement. Learning to trust your other senses takes time. Time we have little of. That last part sent another chill through me. There was definitely a deadline we weren't being told about. I ended up paired with O'Malley while Gunther got stuck with Jennings. As I tied the blindfold in place, the world went completely black. The fabric was thick enough that not even a hint of light penetrated. Were they enchanted somehow? First lesson, Frida's voice came from somewhere to my left. Sound is not just what you hear with your ears. Feel the vibrations through your feet. Let the stone tell you where your opponent stands. I tried to focus on what she meant, feeling slightly ridiculous as I concentrated on my boots. But after a moment, I noticed subtle variations in the way sound moved through the arena. O'Malley's breathing seemed to come from multiple directions, but I zeroed in on the likely spot and turned to face where she stood. Good, Frida said, and I jumped because she was suddenly right beside me. I hadn't heard her move at all. Not a footstep. Not even the clicking of those metal beads in her braids. How the heck had she managed that? You're starting to understand. Now defend yourself. The attack came without warning. Something swept my legs out from under me, and I hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind from my lungs. Around me, I heard thuds and cursing as my teammates met similar fates. That was pathetic, Frida announced. Again. And this time... Remember, your enemy won't wait for you to be ready. As I pushed myself up, trying to ignore the ache in my tailbone, I heard Durgan laugh somewhere across the arena. Perhaps humans should stick to fighting in daylight, where they belong. A crunching noise accompanied the dwarf's grunt, and then I felt the reverberation of something hitting the ground. Perhaps you should focus more on your own training, Frida snapped. I couldn't help smiling at that even as I settled back into a defensive stance. The next 3 weeks were going to be brutal, but at least we weren't the only ones getting our asses handed to us. Remember, Frida called out as training resumed, the darkness is not your enemy. It is your teacher. Learn from it or die by it. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made my skin prickle. Because where you're going, the light will only get you killed. As her words echoed through the arena, I glimpsed Reed whispering urgently to the ambassador. Benson's face remained impassive, but her fingers tightened visibly on the railing. Dromender smiled thinly, the satisfaction evident in his posture as he exchanged a knowing look with Firehelm. Only Morales' expression betrayed genuine concern. And despite us being on tense terms, I could tell his worry wasn't about the mission or the politics, but for us. Whatever was coming, I had the distinct impression that our observers knew far more about it than we did. And judging by their reactions, we had every reason to be worried. Chapter 5. I stood among my fellow AFOs in the dimly lit chamber as Frida paced before us, the strange tattoos on her forearms seeming to shift in the low light. A handful of dwarven observers lined the walls, their expressions unreadable in the low light. 3 weeks, Frida said, her voice echoing off the stone walls. In 3 weeks, you've learned more about darkness fighting than most manage in 3 months. But... She stopped pacing and fixed us with an intense stare. Panic will be your downfall in this trial. When your heart races and your breath quickens, that is when mistakes happen. That is when you die. I shifted my weight, feeling the comfortable heft of my gear. We'd trained hard for this, but Frida's words still sent a shiver of worry through me. Light is your enemy here, she continued, her voice growing harder. Heat is your friend. Remember this. She paused, scanning our faces. This is your last chance. Walk out that door now, and you can return to your previous lives. Stay, and you face the ancient labyrinth, a maze that has claimed more lives than I care to count. I glanced at my fellow AFOs. Despite the gravity of Frida's words, no one moved. We didn't have a choice, and we'd come too far to back down now. Good, Frida nodded, apparently satisfied with our resolve. Your task is simple in theory. Navigate the labyrinth and emerge on the other side. In practice. She let out a dark chuckle. Nothing is ever quite what it seems in the dark. My mind raced with the implications. Heat? In a pitch-black maze? Before I could puzzle it out further, Frida was moving toward a heavy stone door at the end of the chamber. Remember your training, she said, her hand resting on the door's surface. Remember what I taught you about sensing your environment, about moving without sight. Most importantly, she pushed the door open, revealing absolute darkness beyond. Remember that down here, darkness is life. Light is death. I followed the others through the heavy doors, emerging into a high-ceilinged chamber where torchlight danced across ancient stone walls. Brokerdrotten Firehelm stood imposingly on a raised dais as he conversed in low tones with Grimir. The master craftsman swayed slightly as he stood, his elaborate beard knots sparkling with embedded gems as he nodded solemnly at whatever Firehelm was saying. I wasn't surprised to see that Colonel Monk was present again, standing stiffly beside Ambassador Benson. The ambassador's expression was neutral rather than optimistic as she surveyed the gathering. Unlike Monk's rigid posture, Benson thrummed her fingers against the lapel of her business suit, her eyes sharp and assessing. Captain Morales caught my gaze from where he stood behind the ambassador, his perpetually furrowed brow deepening as he stared me down. The suspicion in his eyes was clear. He suspected I had some trick I wasn't sharing. I merely shrugged at him, palms slightly upturned. No tricks here, Captain. We were all equally screwed. My thoughts drifted to the series of injections we'd been receiving over the past 3 weeks. Enhanced ocular adaptation, the medics had called it. The shots had burned going in, leaving our eyes watering for hours afterward. They hadn't explained much, only that it would help us see better in the darkness. But Frida's final words echoed in my mind. Darkness is life, light is death, heat, not light. I rubbed my eyes, suddenly worried. What if these enhancements were a liability instead of an advantage? What if whatever waited in that labyrinth would be made worse by increased light sensitivity? Firehelm stepped forward, his commanding presence drawing all eyes. The shadows played across his features as he raised his hands, and the chamber fell silent. "The second trial begins," he announced, his deep voice resonating through the chamber. "The labyrinth of eternal night awaits those who would prove their worth." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Whatever waited in that darkness, we'd face it. We had to. It had been dark in the spongy cavern of the Grunvarger, which made my stomach churn at the prospect of what other native predators lurked in the maze. But Frida's warning kept replaying in my mind. We couldn't afford to panic. "Remember the plan," I said to Gunther, Lewis, and Jennings, who stood close by. "We do this together. If they send us in one by one, hang back." Jennings bounced on the balls of his feet as he gave a distracted nod, and Gunther took a puff from an inhaler that the medics had given some of us to manage our lungs. The 3 AFO teams had each been given specific instructions. The higher-ups had been strategizing since the moment we'd learned about this darkness trial, and after Gunther's ankle and Hayes being sent home, they weren't about to leave anything to chance. The dwarves had proven this wasn't just some ceremony. Lives were at stake. "Wish they hadn't taken our damn comms," Lewis griped. "We'll just have to do without." I tried to sound confident, but wasn't sure I'd pulled it off. I waited as Firehelm positioned us all before the massive stone door, keeping my breath even. Ancient chains creaked and groaned overhead as dwarven engineers worked the mechanism to raise it, revealing nothing but impenetrable darkness beyond. 2 by 2, teams disappeared into the darkness. I kept my attention fixed on Lewis, Jennings, and Gunther, determined not to lose track of them in the chaos of deployment. When our turn came, I stepped through the threshold alongside Lewis, the darkness swallowing us completely. We turned the first corner, and I reached out blindly until my fingers found Lewis's sleeve. The fabric was damp owing to mistiness in the air, and I clutched a fistful of it and tugged him along behind me. Following our routine, we moved forward cautiously until we literally bumped into Jennings and Gunther. "Watch it," Gunther whispered, though there was no real heat in his voice. Lewis rustled around in his gear, and I heard the familiar sound of rope being unwound. We'd practiced this dozens of times in our private training sessions on the surface camps, each of us tugging the sectioned rope around our waists to keep the team together in complete darkness. The rope would be our lifeline, quite literally. "All set," Lewis murmured as he finished securing the last knot. "Well then, Peaches," Jennings said, trying for his usual cocky tone, but not quite making it. There was a slight tremor in his voice that betrayed his nervousness. "Ladies first?" I rolled my eyes at the nickname, though no one could see it in the darkness. But I didn't argue. I was the best at reading the subtle changes in air currents that Frida had taught us about, and everyone knew it. "Fine," I said, keeping my voice low. "Remember the signals. 1 tug means stop, 2 means danger, 3 means retreat. And for God's sake, keep the rope taut between us. We lose contact and we're dead." Without waiting for acknowledgement, I took my first step deeper into the labyrinth, feeling the others fall into line behind me through the gentle tension in the rope. The darkness pressed against my skin like a living thing, making every breath feel thick and heavy. I led our team forward, arms outstretched, expecting to find the close confines of a traditional maze. Instead, my fingers met nothing but empty air. The space felt vast, cavernous, more like threading through an underground cathedral than a garden maze. A boot scraped behind me, Jennings probably, and I winced at how the sound echoed. Even our breathing seemed thunderous in the oppressive silence. The rope connecting us stayed taut, our lifeline in this lightless void, and I could feel each person's presence through the subtle vibrations as we moved. The first geyser caught me by surprise. A blast of hot steam hissed somewhere to our left, and I yanked once on the rope, bringing us to a halt. The temperature shifted dramatically, the cool, damp mist that had surrounded us giving way to waves of humid heat. I guided us in a wide arc around the steam vent, remembering Frida's words about heat being our friend. But too much heat would cook us just as surely as whatever else waited in this darkness. "It's getting hot as hell in here," Jennings whispered, his voice carrying far more than he probably intended. "Shut up," I hissed back, though the damage was already done. That's when I heard it, a familiar chitinous clicking that made my stomach clench. The sound felt smaller than the Grunvarger I'd encountered, but there were more of them. Many more. Scraping skittered across stone, the noise coming from all directions. Dozens of creatures moving in the darkness around us. I pulled twice on the rope, danger, and felt the team draw closer together. The clicking intensified, growing louder, more insistent. These weren't the massive predators I'd faced before, but their numbers made them no less threatening. My mind raced through Frida's lessons, trying to remember anything about smaller cave-dwelling creatures, but came up blank. The skittering grew closer, and I could feel the vibrations through the stone beneath my boots. Whatever these things were, they were coming for us. I was starting to really lament the fact that I wasn't wearing metal-soled boots like our dwarven counterparts as I drew the sword strapped to my back, wondering what help the weapon would be against an army of what I now imagined were either crabs or scorpions. Then a blue-green light glinted from the blade, and I squinted against the brightness. I blinked rapidly as my eyes watered, the sudden illumination painful after the absolute darkness. A soft glow emanated from our right, casting enough light to reveal the shocked expressions on my teammates' faces. Looking down, I caught glimpses of plated bodies. Dozens of crab-like creatures scuttling away from us into the shadows, their segmented legs clicking against stone as they retreated. Jennings heaved deep breaths beside me, running a trembling hand over his close-cropped hair. Before I could stop him, he took a step toward the mysterious light source. I yanked once on the rope, our signal to halt, but he kept moving. "I'm not going the same direction as those nasty crabs," he hissed, voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Remember what Frida said," Gunther whispered urgently. "Light is death down here." As if to emphasize his point, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the cavern, bouncing off unseen walls until I couldn't tell its origin. The mysterious glow retreated, pushing the darkness back toward us. My enhanced eyes adjusted quickly, though tears still leaked down my cheeks from the earlier exposure. I cast around, trying to get my bearings in the vast space. We stood on relatively open ground, with geysers erupting at irregular intervals around us. Their hiss and steam provided a strange sort of compass, areas of heat that we could use to navigate. To our left, I noticed a passage where the steam vents were clustered more densely together, creating a corridor of warmth we could follow. "This way," I murmured, tugging the rope to guide everyone left. "Stay close to the geysers. Their heat will help us sense the walls." The rope went taut as my team fell in line behind me and blackness settled around us. I made a note that Jennings was way more freaked about this than he was saying out loud, and here that made him a liability. It made the loss of our comms devices more cutting, and I just hoped he could keep his mouth shut so that whatever had caused that scream didn't catch up to us. I kept moving forward, stopping every few steps to let the air currents play across my face. The steam vents hissed periodically, their heat signatures helping me track our position relative to the walls. Behind me, I felt the rope pull slightly as my team followed, their breaths controlled but audible in the oppressive darkness. I strained to hear any approaching threats, remembering how Frida had appeared beside me during training without a sound. Not even those metal beads in her hair had betrayed her presence. After weeks of darkness training, I still had no explanation for how she did it. The dwarves insisted they didn't use magic the way elves did, but I was beginning to suspect a sound-dampening enchantment. Either that, or Frida possessed a level of physical control that bordered on the supernatural. The passage gradually narrowed until my outstretched fingers could brush both walls. The rough stone felt warm and sticky to the touch, and I prayed it wasn't the same lichen that had lined the cavern I'd fallen into during the first trial. Every so often, a distant clicking would echo through the tunnels, making the rope go taut as Jennings tensed. Whatever those crab-like creatures were, they seemed thoroughly spooked by the light display. Did that mean they were harmless? It was hard to say. We navigated countless intersections, and at each one I paused to feel the heat patterns. I chose the warmer ones every time. The rope-linked chain of bodies behind me waited patiently during these moments of assessment, though I could feel Jennings's growing restlessness through his constant shifting. I was reaching out to feel another intersection when my hand connected with something solid and distinctly not stone. Whatever it was screeched, a horrible, inhuman sound that sent ice through my veins. I stumbled backward, colliding hard with Jennings, who let out a startled yelp. The clicking started again, but this was different from the smaller creatures. This sound reverberated through the passage, deeper and more menacing. I could feel vibrations through my boots as something massive moved in the darkness ahead. "Shit, shit, shit," Jennings hissed, and I heard the distinctive sound of his sword being drawn. The creature lunged. I felt the air displacement a split second before claw scraped against stone, giving me just enough time to dodge left. Jennings wasn't so lucky. The impact knocked him backward, yanking the rope painfully around my waist. "Form up," I shouted, abandoning stealth. The thing knew exactly where we were anyway. Metal rang against what sounded like armor as Jennings slashed wildly in the dark. His panicked breathing echoed off the walls as he swung again and again, each impact sending jarring vibrations through the rope that connected us. "Stop flailing," I commanded, trying to track the creature's position by sound. Its squalling had grown more agitated, accompanied by the scratch of claws on stone as it maneuvered in the tight space. The team spread out, the rope taut so that we'd each have room to swing our swords without skewering each other. I sidestepped, keeping my back to the wall, and thrust my sword where I calculated the thing should be. The blade skittered off its armored hide, but the creature's screech told me I'd at least made contact with something it could feel. Jennings had devolved into full panic mode, shouting incoherently as he hacked at the darkness. The rope connecting us went slack for a moment, then snapped taut as the creature apparently knocked him. Then came the thud of a body hitting the ground. "Get up!" I yelled, lunging forward to strike at where I'd last heard the clicking. My blade slid across a smooth surface, then sunk into something soft between plates of exoskeleton. Hot liquid splashed across my hand as I yanked the sword free. The creature thrashed violently, its armored body scraping against both walls of the narrow passage. I heard Gunther grunt in pain, but the rope held, keeping us together in the chaos. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably less than a minute, the screeches stopped. The creature's massive body slumped against the tunnel wall with a final, rattling hiss. We all stood frozen, gasping for breath in the darkness. The rope swayed gently between us as we each tried to recover our composure. I could hear Jennings muttering what sounded like prayers under his breath. "Everyone still attached?" I asked quietly, giving the rope a gentle tug. Mumbled affirmatives answered my question. But before I could suggest we move on, the weird blue-green glow seeped around the corner ahead of us. The light was faint but growing stronger, and I squinted against its approach, tears already forming in my so-called enhanced eyes. "Don't," I warned as I felt Jennings shift toward the illumination. "Remember that scream earlier? We stick to the plan." The light continued to creep closer, and I could now make out the massive form of the creature we'd killed. It looked like a giant version of the crab things from earlier, its dark carapace gleaming wetly where my sword had found gaps in its armor. I was about to signal that we should head in the other direction when I caught sight of the glow coming from behind. I cursed under my breath. Whatever the hell this was, it had us trapped. The blue-green light crept closer from both directions, and I could feel Jennings trembling through the rope that connected us. The illumination revealed strange chains of what looked like bioluminescent fungi stretching along the walls. But there was something wrong about their movement. Too coordinated, too purposeful, too damn fast. "Those aren't plants," Gunther whispered. "They've got to be interconnected somehow." "Back the way we came," I decided quickly. "We know that intersection had another path we didn't take." "Run for it," Lewis asked, already shifting his weight in preparation. I nodded. "On 3. 1. 3! Jennings shouted, bolting before I could finish the count. We had no choice but to follow as he yanked the rope, our careful formation dissolving into a desperate sprint. The glow intensified as we passed, and I caught glimpses of writhing tendrils reaching for us from the walls. Jennings's scream cut through the darkness as he stumbled. The rope went taut, nearly pulling us all down. I turned to see luminous tendrils wrapped around his leg, pulsing with bright light that burned my eyes. In that brief, terrible moment of illumination, I saw the true horror of the web we were running into. What I'd thought were simple strands of light were actually part of a massive, pale mass that clung to the walls and ceiling. Translucent tissues rippled with bioluminescence, and more tendrils unfurled from the central mass like hungry fingers. "There's a bigger one!" Gunther shouted, pointing back toward the intersection we'd passed earlier. Through my tears, I saw he was right. An enormous pale form lurked in the passage we'd originally taken, its tendrils reaching eagerly toward Jennings. "Side passage!" Gunther called out, gesturing to our right. "I felt the heat from there earlier." I drew my sword and hacked at the glowing tendrils that held Jennings. The creature's flesh parted easily, more like slicing through thick jelly than muscle. But the finger-like tendrils kept coming. A high-pitched keening filled the air as I used the sword like a damn axe to smash them to bits, and eventually their light dimmed. "Move!" I grabbed Jennings' arm and hauled him up. He stumbled but found his feet, and we all sprinted for the side passage Gunther had indicated. We abandoned all pretense of stealth, our boots thundering against stone as we ran. Sickening crunches under our feet suggested we'd found another nest of the crab creatures. But we couldn't afford to slow down. The clicking of their claws joined the ruckus of our ragged breathing and pounding steps. The passage twisted and turned, but I kept moving toward the areas marked only by greater heat. The air grew steadily warmer, almost uncomfortably so, until sweat ran freely down my face. We rounded one final corner and skidded to a halt. An orange glow illuminated the passage ahead. Not the blue-green of the monster, but the natural light of flowing lava. A narrow stone bridge stretched across a river of molten rock, leading to what had to be the exit on the far side. "Oh, thank God," Lewis breathed, doubling over with his hands on his knees. Jennings leaned against the wall, still trembling. Those things, they were in my head, whispering, showing me the way out. "They were talking?" Lewis spat incredulously. Gunther swallowed. "I think I heard them too. One had my arm for a hot minute." I wiped my forehead with my sleeve, studying the bridge ahead. The heat was intense, but after what we'd just escaped, a little more sweat seemed like a small price to pay. "It doesn't matter. We're out. We did it," I said, already untying the rope from my waist. Supposing the bridge isn't a trap of some kind. I watched as Jennings examined his leg where the luminous tendrils had grabbed him. Even in the orange glow from the lava, I could see angry red welts forming through his torn pants. "Burns like hell," he muttered, testing his weight on it. He took a limping step toward the bridge, and Lewis immediately moved to support him. "I got you, man," Lewis said, wrapping an arm around Jennings's waist. "Let's get the hell out of here." Gunther followed them onto the narrow span, cradling an arm, leaving me to bring up the rear. I turned to face the darkness we'd emerged from, straining to hear any signs of the other teams. The passage remained silent except for the bubbling of lava below. How many had encountered those light creatures? How many had fallen for their whispered promises of escape? The memory of that earlier scream echoed in my mind, and I hoped it hadn't belonged to any of our crew. I backed onto the bridge, keeping my eyes fixed on the darkness until the heat became too intense to linger. Someone would have answers on the other side. They'd better have answers. Because whatever that thing was in the maze, it wasn't just some mindless predator. And right now, the fact that the dwarves kept it locked up in here as some kind of test felt like a sick joke. Chapter 6. I eyed the so-called tea apprehensively as I sat in the dwarven equivalent of a hospital ward, glad at least that I was faring better than a lot of the AFOs who suffered a combination of injuries along with the ongoing lung problems. It had taken a few days for our human medics to finally concede that the burns from the creature, the Lisman Dire I'd later learned, were beyond their ability to heal. From there, we'd all been shuffled in here for an exam, and despite protesting that I was fine, I was told in no uncertain terms that I'd submit to dwarven medicine. That's nasty. Lewis eyeballed his tea across from me, sitting on a spongy substance that appeared to grow out of the floor. It was just as springy as a mattress, but I did have qualms about how dwarves changed the sheets. "Bottoms up, soldier," Captain Morales said as he stalked past. Morales had been hovering ever since we emerged from the labyrinth. A whole new contingency team of AFOs had been brought in to cover our shifts while we recovered, but I suspected Morales hadn't left Benson's side since then. The ambassador herself was on a tour of the ward as dwarf physicians spoke with her about whatever it was that alien doctors discussed with diplomats. I hoped that meant that Earth wasn't planning to acquire some Lismandir as a magical security measure or something equally stupid. "Come on, Lopez, you first." I grunted and swirled the murky brown substance in my cup. It would supposedly strengthen my lung capacity, and while I thought it wouldn't hurt, I found the dose entirely unnecessary, and I didn't even want to consider what this stuff was made of. I've seen you eat worse. I gave Lewis a flat stare. Entirely sober. The AFO gave me a long-suffering look and shook his head before pinching his nose and lifting the cup. My lip curled as I watched him gulp it down in one shot, and his eyes popping told me everything that I needed to know. Oh man. He sucked in his cheeks. That was everything I thought it was going to be. I stared at my own cup again, trying not to breathe through my nose. Movement caught my eye, and I glanced over to where Jennings and Gunther were being treated. The burns from the Lismandir had left angry red welts across their arms and torsos, and a female dwarf healer was methodically wrapping the wounds with what looked suspiciously like seaweed. Letting them suffer for days, the dwarf muttered, her face twisted with annoyance. Human medicine, bah. These burns could easily have turned bad and claimed a limb. She shot a disapproving look at our medics who stood awkwardly nearby. I smiled, not because of the commentary, but that I could understand it audibly. With no broadband translation devices in the room, it still rang through on my comms, but it left the medics to presumably interpret from her facial expression. I remembered seeing some dwarven warriors after the trial with similar injuries, but none of them were here in the ward now. Either they'd already recovered, or... I pushed that thought away. The dwarves knew their own world best. If they'd gotten immediate treatment, they were probably already back to training. "Lopez," Lewis hissed. "Quit stalling." With a grimace, I lifted the cup. The smell hit me first, like stagnant pond water mixed with decomposing vegetation. I held my breath and tipped it back, forcing myself to swallow. The taste was even worse than the smell, somehow managing to be both bitter and slimy at the same time. It coated my tongue and throat, leaving an aftertaste that reminded me of moldy earth. "That's..." I coughed, fighting the urge to scrape my tongue against my teeth. "That's something." The deep resonance of training gongs echoed through the chamber, and I'd never been so grateful for their call. Lewis and I exchanged glances before setting our empty cups aside and pushing to our feet. My stomach churned unpleasantly as we made our way toward the exit, but I told myself that breathing easier would be worth it. "Think any others will join us today?" Lewis asked as we headed for the arena. I glanced back at Jennings and Gunther, still being wrapped in their glowing bandages, and others beyond them. There's gotta be at least a few. I fell into step beside Lewis as we entered the training arena, the familiar scent of stone dust and sweat filling my nostrils. The usual clamor of clashing weapons and grunted exertions was notably subdued. Fewer than half the normal contingent had made it to training. Most of the dwarven soldiers who'd survived the Lismunder encounter were present, but many of our AFO colleagues were back on the hospital ward. "Looks like we're the lucky ones," Lewis muttered, rolling his shoulders as we moved to our usual position. The hour passed in a blur of defensive forms and footwork drills. As we worked through the sequences, I noticed something different. My breathing came easier, deeper. The disgusting tea had worked. Each inhale filled my lungs completely, without the slight catch that had plagued me since the first trial. When the final gong sounded, I followed the others toward the exit, but Yorman's sharp command stopped us. "Wait!" His voice echoed off the stone walls. "All of you, remain." Frida moved to stand beside him, her bearing as stern and uncompromising as ever as she studied us with unusual intensity. Movement in the gallery above drew my attention, and I felt my spine stiffen as I recognized Firehelm's imposing figure. Beside him stood Grimir, fondling the gems in his snowy white beard. "The next trial approaches." Firehelm's deep voice rolled through the chamber. "You have shown individual skill, but now you must prove something far more vital. Your ability to work as one." My stomach clenched. Something in his tone set off warning bells in my mind. "The Unity trial will test not just your strength and courage," Grimir added, his milky eye somehow finding each of us in turn, but your capacity to trust and protect those beside you. For you will face a nest of Grunvarger. A ripple of tension passed through the dwarves, even as the name of the beast sent a wave of dread through my belly. I stood a little straighter as I recalled the scraping sounds that had pursued me through the dark caves. Make no mistake, Firehelm continued. Teamwork will mean the difference between life and death. A lone warrior, no matter how skilled, cannot survive an encounter with an entire colony of Grunvarger. Only by working together will you have any hope of success. An entire what? My mouth fell open and I swore I tasted the pond water tea all over again. Or maybe that was just rising bile. Jormund stepped forward, his gold teeth flashing as he spoke. From this moment, all training will be conducted in teams. You will eat together, train together, plan together. Your lives will depend on one another. Frida produced a scroll and began reading off names. I listened with growing apprehension until she called out, Team 3, Asha Lopez, Matthias Gunther, Durgan Glotzkeger, and Thordis Steinhammer. My heart sank as I looked across the arena. Durgan's blue-tipped beard seemed to bristle as he met my gaze, his usual sneer firmly in place. Beside him, Thordis gripped her hammer so tightly her knuckles whitened. Neither of them bothered to hide their displeasure at being paired with humans. Gunther wouldn't even be here for several more days as he recovered from the Lismunder burns. I could already imagine how well this was going to work. 2 humans, one of whom had a hard time with dwarven weapons paired with 2 dwarves who openly despised us. Your team assignments are final, Frida announced, as if sensing the widespread discontent. You will begin training together from tomorrow. Those still in medical recovery will join as soon as they are deemed fit. I caught Lewis giving me a sympathetic look as he moved to join his own team. At least he'd been paired with dwarves who seemed marginally less hostile. Tomorrow, Jormund called out, we begin specialized training for the Unity trial. Come prepared to learn new techniques. Crossing swords with each other cannot wholly prepare you against these creatures of claw and mandible. As the groups dispersed, I found myself face to face with my new teammates. Thordis looked me up and down, her expression suggesting she'd found something unpleasant on the bottom of her boot. We meet at first bell, she said curtly. Don't be late. I will be there, I said in Dwarven, causing them both to raise their eyebrows in surprise. But then their eyes narrowed suspiciously, and they turned in unison to stalk off. I watched them go, wondering how we were supposed to trust each other with our lives when we could barely manage civil conversation. Despite my frustration, I couldn't deny both had shown remarkable skill during our training sessions. Durgan moved with impressive precision, his sword work methodical and technically flawless. It was a stark contrast to Thordis, whose fighting style was all explosive power and unconventional angles. Together, they complemented each other perfectly. And while neither would admit it, I surmised Gunther's defensive magic would round out our team. That was, if we could figure out a way to work together. The sound of scraping claws and clicking mandibles filled my mind, and I suppressed a shudder. Whatever personal differences we had, we'd better figure them out fast. Something told me the Grunvarger wouldn't care about human-dwarf politics when they were trying to tear us apart. I trudged back to the surface camp alongside Lewis, both of us quiet as we processed the news about the upcoming trial. The morning sun didn't even manage to lift my mood, and I had to shield my eyes against its brightness. Could be worse, Lewis offered half-heartedly. At least you got Gunther's defensive magic. I shot him a dark look. When he's healed. And you know how he is with a sword. Lewis winced. Yeah, well, good luck with that. He clapped me on the shoulder before heading toward the mess station. Instead of following, I veered off toward the outskirts of camp where I knew I'd find Gotha. The gnome had set up her workspace beneath a weathered tarp, surrounded by her tools and various gadgetry. As I approached, I could see her hunched over her workbench, tiny fingers manipulating something that glowed with a soft blue light. Ah, the warrior returns, she said without looking up. Your footsteps ring heavy today. I dropped onto a wooden crate beside her. That obvious, huh? To these wise ears? Always. She continued working with a smirk. The crystalline structure in her fingers caught the light, sending prismatic patterns dancing across the tarp. They announced the next trial, I said, watching Gotha manipulate the gem as her fingers crackled with magic. We're going up against Grunvarger, a whole nest of them. Nasty creatures, very nasty. She clicked her tongue. Not alone, Hope? With 2 dwarves who hate humans and Gunther who... I trailed off, not wanting to speak ill of my fellow soldier. Who treats his sword like it might bite him? Gotha finished with a cackle. Yes, you already say. The man do better with books than blades. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. And he's still recovering from the Lismandir burns. We're supposed to trust each other with our lives, but I'm not sure Thordis and Durgan would piss on us if we were on fire. This could help, she said, nodding toward the crystal. I could have it ready for trial. Something to give you just in case. She paused mid-sentence, her eyes tracking something on the ground. With striking speed, she snatched up what looked like a fat slug and dropped it into one of the many glass bottles littering her workspace. I tried not to think about whether that was destined to be a snack for later. I considered her offer for a moment, recalling what the gnome had said about the Velimir supposedly acting like a magical rechargeable battery. But then I shook my head. I've already gotten away with sneaking something into the first trial. If Captain Morales found out, he'd kick my ass. Gotha's eyes twinkled. Perhaps you wiser than they think. How did new partners take news? Well, my lips turned upward. I answered Thordis in Dwarven when she told me not to be late for training tomorrow. Gotha threw her head back and laughed, the sound echoing across the barren plains. Oh, to have seen dwarf faces. Did they swallow beards in shock? Close to it. I chuckled, remembering their expressions. Though I'm not sure it helped my case. They looked even more suspicious after that. Good, Gotha said, setting down her tools. Let them be suspect. Better than dismiss. Now, shall we continue your lessons? I was about to respond when movement caught my eye. Captain Morales stood beyond the edge of the cluster of trees, his expression unreadable as he observed us. But his arms folded across his chest spoke volumes. How long had he been there? Lopez, he said, his voice carefully neutral. I stood to attention, my mouth suddenly dry. Sir, Gotha's been helping me learn Dwarven. It's proven useful in training. Has it now? Morales's lip curled as he stared at the gnome. With me, Lopez. Time for you to finally report in on your extracurricular activities. I followed Morales back to the surface camp, casting an apologetic glance at Gotha, who had visibly shrunk beneath his scrutiny. My stomach churned with guilt at having potentially caused problems for the gnome who had helped me so much. Sit? Morales gestured to a metal folding chair inside the command tent. Wait here. I slumped into the chair after he left, mentally kicking myself for being so careless. Of course, someone would eventually track me to Gotha's workspace. I should have reported the language lessons at minimum, even if I'd wanted to keep the lodestone exchanges quiet. The tent flap sectioning off that part of the dome rustled when Morales returned with Reed and Major Harrington in tow. Reed tugged at his silk tie as he claimed a seat, while Harrington remained standing, his weathered face set in stern lines. Report, Lopez, Morales commanded. Everything. Start with how you began conversing with the gnome. I took a deep breath. Gotha approached me shortly after we arrived, sir. Her people are destitute on the surface, and I don't know where she picked up English. She offered to teach me Dwarven in exchange for... I hesitated before pushing forward. In exchange for small amounts of lodestones from my personal allocation, and tutoring to improve her English skills. Harrington's jaw clenched. How many lodestones exactly? Just a few fragments, sir. Nothing that would impact my duties. The gnomes here are suffering without access to magic. They're treated as second-class citizens by the dwarves, and... That's not your concern, Lopez. Morales cut in. What information have you shared with her? About our capabilities? Our numbers? The ambassador's movements? Nothing classified, sir. We mostly discussed language and culture. She helped me understand dwarven customs, which has been valuable in training. And... I swallowed. She provided the blue stones that helped us all survive the first trial. Reed leaned forward at this, his features sharpening with interest. How much Dwarven have you actually learned? Enough to follow basic conversations, sir, training commands, some cultural terms. I can form simple sentences. And you didn't think to report this skill acquisition? Morales' voice dripped with disapproval. I should have, sir. I was wrong. I met his gaze. But please understand, the gnomes here are desperate. They're treated worse than dogs by the dwarves. Gotha just wanted enough magic to maintain her community. She's been nothing but helpful. That's not the point, Harrington growled. You've been supplying magical resources to a foreign entity without authorization. Do you have any idea of the diplomatic implications? Major. Reed held up a hand. Perhaps we should consider the intelligence advantages of having someone who can understand Dwarven without translation devices, especially given recent developments with the trials. I seized on this opening. Gotha has no political aspirations, sirs. She's an artisan who just wants to practice her craft and keep her people fed and sheltered. The amount of magic I've shared has helped get their agricultural plants operational again. They aren't powering weapons. You're not qualified to make that assessment, Morales said. For all you know, she's been gathering intelligence on our vulnerabilities this entire time and giving it back to the dwarves. I went to protest the last part, but the words died in my mouth. I wasn't going to convince them. It didn't matter how much I believed that Gotha was genuine. Return to your quarters, Lopez, Harrington ordered. We'll discuss your consequences once we've consulted with Ambassador Benson. I stood, my heart sinking. What about Gotha? She doesn't deserve... Dismissed, Lopez. Morales' tone left no room for argument. I trudged out of the room, the weight of my decisions pressing down on me. As I made my way to my quarters, I couldn't shake the image of Gotha's frightened expression when Morales had appeared. I'd meant well, trying to help someone in need while gaining valuable knowledge in return. But I'd gone about it all wrong, letting my sympathy override protocol. Now my actions might have consequences not just for me, but for the gentle gnome who had become something of a friend. I collapsed onto my bunk, still in my training gear, wondering whether I'd still face my new team tomorrow or be shuffled through a gate home to face a court-martial. Somehow, I figured it was more important to them that they save face with the dwarves and have me complete the final trial. But I couldn't count on that. And after close to 6 months on Azagrim, getting my ass kicked all the way back to Earth was disheartening, even in the face of a nest of Grunvarger. All I could do now was wait for the verdict and hope that Reed's pragmatic view of the situation would balance out Morales' suspicion and Harrington's by-the-book fury. Chapter 7. When I was brought into Benson's apartments, I thought it was to be dressed down before being shipped back home. I stood to attention awkwardly in her living quarters as she prepared a cup of tea, her facial features devoid of fake smiles she showed when mixing with the dwarves. "You can leave, Captain Morales," she said with a note of weariness in her tone. "Unless you think I need security against one of our own?" Morales raised his eyebrows but didn't object. As he left, he shot me a lingering look that told me I better be on my best behavior. "Asha Lopez, please sit." I swallowed and glanced at what appeared to be the same spongy substance from the hospital, now impersonating sofas. I was used to being chastised standing up, but Ambassador Benson wasn't a soldier. She was a diplomat. After sitting gingerly, I kept my back straight and folded my hands in my lap as I waited for her to join me. I'm told you've been making friends up on the surface camp, she said dryly. Yes, ma'am. Major Harrington doesn't approve. He says that gnomes have been pests since our arrival, pilfering whatever they can get their hands on outside the dome. I don't know anything about that, ma'am. She took a long sip of tea, her eyes calculating as she studied me. For what it's worth, I haven't told Gotha anything compromising. With respect, I'm sure I know nothing compromising about the talks given that I've never witnessed them. Why then? She cocked her head. You've got the comms device. I'd like to understand why you thought it necessary to learn dwarven. I frowned. What did it matter? Or did she think she could trip me up if she asked enough questions? Not everything translates, ma'am. The others are happy to rely on the comms and go venturing out to see the sights in the city while off duty. I guess. I like to know more before going into a situation. And up there, with the sun on my face after spending the last 15 years with Earth's new climate, it's been nice, I guess. Benson took a sip of tea, and I thought I caught a hint of amusement in her eye. And has it helped? The lessons? Well, I wondered whether knocking the snotty look from Thordis's face counted as helpful. I wouldn't have gotten the stones which helped us breathe in the first trial without them. The ones which you didn't clear before handing them out like candy to every AFO stationed here? The ones that likely saved at least a few lives, with respect. Benson pursed her lips and crossed her legs. If it weren't for these trials, we probably would have sent you home for that, you know? Soldiers, I'm told, are supposed to follow orders, not to make decisions. I swallowed, figuring I'd heard enough to know what was coming next. You're lucky that these dwarves seem to place so much importance on the performance of 12 humans. Not all of them were happy that King Jarnkrona agreed to the talks. He has absolute power for foreign affairs, of course, but like all of us in politics, he needs to appease those around him. The Bordering, a round table of their rulers, seemed to have cooked up this idea and are determined to see it through. So I should expect consequences after the trials finish, I inferred, both relieved and not yet off the hook. Right now, I'm trying to work out whether you're more used to me as an asset who understands Dwarven, or if your skills with a sword help our cause more. She shrugged and stood, teacup and saucer balanced in her tight grip as she stalked over to her desk. I'm told you all need to commit to training over the coming weeks. That means we need to allocate more resources to security. If I were to pull you into the negotiations room with me now, it would arouse suspicion. But had you told me about your activities earlier? Well, we could have figured out an injury to disqualify you from moving onward. It seemed I was a pawn who was now in the wrong position on the board in retrospect, like I should have expected any different. You have my apologies, ma'am. Her eyes narrowed slightly, like she was trying to discern whether I was being genuine. But after taking another sip of tea, she smacked her lips, and I couldn't quite decide if that meant she found my apology wanting. Keep your head down, soldier, and get back to training. She gestured at the door. And if you come across anything that'll assist your country to secure this deal in the coming weeks, you'll come straight to me. Understood? I refrained from sighing and stood, warring with whether I should protest that nothing I'd come across from Gotha had anything to do with her work in the negotiation rooms. But it was pointless, so I nodded instead. Understood, ma'am. When I glanced over my shoulder, I wasn't surprised to see Morales giving me the stink eye from his position next to Benson in the arena's viewing gallery. I sighed, still annoyed about the frisking I'd received before leaving the surface camp for the final trial, and tried to thrust it away and focus on the task at hand. Jormund approached our team with a length of chains with manacles attached, and I puffed out my cheeks. I hadn't seen Gotha since coming clean about our little language exchange arrangement. Between the grueling training sessions with Thordis and Durgan and the constant supervision from both sides, sneaking off for illicit Dwarven lessons hadn't exactly been feasible. Morales hadn't said what punishment lay ahead so far, and I thought the final trial probably qualified as punishment enough. Supposing we survived. The cold metal of the manacle clicked around my ankle, and I tried not to think about how permanent it felt. Thordis stood rigid beside me, her hammer gripped white-knuckled in both hands. On my other side, Durgan's split beard quivered with each measured breath he took. Gunther, positioned at the far end next to him, looked about as stable as a house of cards in a windstorm. As Team 3, we'd been sequestered in a holding chamber while the first two teams faced their trials. The roars and screams that had filtered through the stone walls told us enough. Now, standing in the center of the blood-stained arena, the evidence was impossible to ignore. Dark smears marred the stone floor, trailing toward the exit tunnels where bodies had been dragged away. A severed Grunvarger claw lay forgotten near a puddle of something thick and viscous, its jointed plating gleaming under the light of the massive fire pits that illuminated the arena. Whatever had happened to the first two teams had been messy, considering the aftermath. "They didn't even clean it properly," Thordis muttered, eyes fixed on a spray of red that painted one section of wall. Durgan grunted in agreement. "Good. Let the scent of blood drive the beasts into a frenzy. I prefer a challenge." I shot him a look, but kept my thoughts to myself. The mob of dwarves watching from tiered seating carved into the cavern walls had fallen silent as Jormund completed locking our team together. The anticipation in the air was palpable. We'd practiced this configuration for weeks, countless hours of coordinated movement, learning to anticipate each other's reactions, developing a wordless language of tugs and tension through the chain that bound us. But facing actual Grunvarger was a far cry from the mechanical constructs we'd trained against. "Remember the plan," Durgan muttered, his usual sneer replaced by grim determination. "Stay tight. Move as one." Gunther's only response was a shallow nod. I'd never seen him quite this pale, though considering the massive iron gates across the arena that would soon release our opponents, I couldn't blame him. My heart was doing its best to crack my ribs. The morning ceremony in the great dining hall felt like it had happened in another lifetime. All that pomp and tradition, the solemn speeches about unity and shared purpose. Now, with the metallic scent of blood filling my nostrils and the evidence of previous battles scattered across the arena floor, reality had stripped away the pageantry. This was about survival, pure and simple. I flexed my fingers around the grip of my sword, drawing comfort from its familiar weight. 4 warriors, 1 chain, and behind those massive gates, a nest of ancient predators waiting to test our mettle. Firehelm stood on a raised platform, his voice booming across the arena as he prepared to signal the start of the trial. I just hoped all those hours of training would be enough to keep us alive. Firehelm's command echoed through the arena, and the grinding of ancient gears filled the air as the iron gates slowly rose. My mouth dried as 5 Grunvarger emerged, their black segmented plates gleaming in the firelight. They moved with speed, mandibles clicking as they spread out in a predatory arc. "Form up," Durgan barked, and we shifted into our practiced circular formation. The chain clinked between us as we moved, each step measured and coordinated. I felt Gunther's presence at my back, his breathing rapid but controlled. The familiar weight of my sword in my hands helped steady my nerves as I tried to recall every lesson from our training. The first Grunvarger lunged without warning, its body uncoiling like a spring. I pivoted, remembering Jormund's instructions about maintaining the Hraunkrona stance. Serrated jaws snapped inches from my face as I deflected its attack, the impact vibrating through my arms. To my left, Durgan methodically engaged his opponent, his movements precise and economical. Each strike of his axe found its mark, slowly dismantling the creature's natural armor. Thordis, true to form, met her Grunvarger head-on, her hammer creating thunderous echoes as she battered at its carapace. A sharp tug on the chain drew my attention momentarily to Gunther. Was he holding up? The distraction cost me as my Grunvarger's claw caught my thigh, tearing through fabric and flesh. I hissed in pain but kept my footing, forcing myself to trust in our formation. to trust that Thordis and Durgan would protect Gunther's flanks. The crowd's roar swelled as Durgan severed one of his opponent's claws, sending it skittering across the blood-stained floor. But the victory was short-lived as another Grunvarger pressed in, forcing him to adjust his stance. The chain between us pulled tight as we compensated for the movement. "Skjolder!" Thordis shouted in Dwarven, and I instinctively ducked as her hammer swept over my head, catching a Grunvarger that had tried to push past. The impact shattered part of its faceplate, dark ichor spraying across the stone. My arms burned from the constant defensive maneuvers and sweat stung my eyes. The training scenarios played through my mind like a desperate mantra. Maintain formation, watch all angles, trust your team. But the cold fear of having these ancient predators up close made the words sound laughable in retrospect. I was operating from instinct. Pure instinct. Through the chaos, I glimpsed an opening. One of the Grunvarger had exposed its softer underbelly as it prepared to strike at Durgan. Without thinking, I lunged forward, my sword finding its mark between the creature's segments. The chain yanked hard at my ankle as the others were forced to adjust to my movement. "Steinhaufud!" Thordis cursed, her hammer connecting with devastating force against another Grunvarger that had nearly taken advantage of my extended position. "You want to get us all killed?" The crowd's reaction shifted from jeers to cheers as the wounded Grunvarger I'd struck thrashed in its death throes. Durgan grunted what might have been approval, though it was hard to tell over the shrill shrieks of the remaining creatures. Crimson ran down my leg from the earlier wound, and I noticed Thordis favoring her left side, where a claw had found its mark. Durgan's split beard was matted with both blood and nasty black ichor, while Gunther's labored breathing behind me spoke of his own injuries. But we were still standing. Even Gunther, who I'd been so worried about, was holding his own, his defensive magic creating barriers that turned aside the worst of the attacks, one of which came up just in time to fend off a strike aimed at Thordis's face. The remaining Grunvarger circled us warily now, their natural instincts perhaps finally registering that their prey wasn't as easy as expected. The crowd's energy pulsed through the arena like a living thing, their collective bloodlust almost tangible in the air. I risked a glance at the viewing gallery where Ambassador Benson watched with calculated interest. I couldn't really tell in the moment if she looked relieved that we stood a good chance, or whether that was just good news for her peace talks. As another Grunvarger launched itself toward us, I squared my shoulders and tightened my grip on my sword. It didn't matter. 2 Grunvarger kept circling, and I tracked their movements while trying to ignore the burning sensation spreading from my thigh wound. We'd taken down another 2 of the beasts in quick succession, one from a perfectly timed combination of Durgan's axe and my sword, the other from Thordis catching it square in what passed for its throat with her hammer. "Status?" Durgan called out, his voice rough with exertion. "Scratched up but functional," Gunther replied, though his breathing suggested otherwise. "My ribs are screaming," Thordis admitted through gritted teeth. "But I can still swing." I hesitated before answering, not wanting to voice my growing concern about the wound on my leg. The burning sensation had intensified, and a numbness was creeping outward from the gash. "I'm standing," I managed. "Barely," Durgan muttered, clearly noticing my increasingly unstable stance. "New plan. Spread out. Give ourselves some room to maneuver. Gunther, barriers ready?" "Good to go," Gunther confirmed, stalking out to the side with his sword up. We shifted our formation, the chain between us growing taut as we created a crescent and backed toward the wall. The remaining Grunvarger reared back, their hissing growing more frenzied as they waited for the perfect time to strike. The first attack came from my left. I pivoted awkwardly, my injured leg threatening to buckle. I caught the creature's claw, deflecting it just enough that its momentum carried it past me. But the movement had cost me, and I stumbled slightly. "Lopez!" Thordis shouted in warning. I looked up in time to see her overextend herself, trying to compensate for my weakness. Her hammer swing went wide, and one of the Grunvarger seized the opportunity. Its claw clamped around her arm with crushing force, yanking her forward. The chain connecting us went suddenly taut, and I felt myself being dragged down. We all hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. Through the chaos, I heard the distinctive click of claws drawing toward us. But then Gunther's barrier flashed into existence above us, a shimmering wall of protective magic. His sword came up at the same instant, catching a set of mandibles that had slipped beneath the barrier's edge. The creature recoiled, dark ichor spraying from where the blade had found purchase. I stared at him in surprise. In all our training sessions, I'd never seen him move that fast or strike that precisely. The quiet, bookish AFO who preferred defensive magic to offensive attacks had just saved all our lives. "Get up!" Durgan roared. "Thordis, fall back!" We scrambled to our feet, the chain tangling momentarily before we sorted ourselves out. Thordis's right arm hung uselessly at her side, her hammer dangling from her left hand. She tried to protest, but Durgan cut her off with a sharp command in Dwarven. I shuffled closer to Durgan and Gunther, doing my best to ignore how the stone floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. The burning in my leg had spread to my hip, and a cold certainty settled in my gut. Those claws had definitely been poisoned. Gunther lowered his barrier on Durgan's signal, and we moved as one to engage the final two Grunvargr. My strikes were growing sluggish, but I kept my blade between myself and those clicking mandibles. Gunther's magic flashed again and again, creating small barriers that redirected the creature's attacks. "No!" Durgan bellowed. I lunged forward, using Gunther's defensive wall as cover. The Grunvargr reared back, its claws scrabbling against the magical barrier. The opening was brief, but it was enough. I thrust past its natural armor and sank my sword deep into flesh. Beside me, Durgan's axe found a similar mark on the other beast. The crowd's roar was deafening as the final Grunvargr fell, its shell cracking as it thrashed, spraying dark ichor across the stained arena floor. But I barely registered the sound. My leg finally gave out, and I dropped to my knees, the chain pulling at my ankle as the others tried to maintain their balance. The victory felt hollow as waves of fire pulsed through my veins. I was dimly aware of Durgan barking orders, of Thordis cursing through her own pain, of Gunther calling for the healers. But all I could focus on was fighting to remain conscious as the poison worked its way deeper into my system. Chapter 8. I stared at the pile of dwarven armor laid out on the stone bench, its polished plates gleaming in the warm light of the preparation chamber. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached for the first piece, my thigh protesting even at that simple movement. The Grunvargr's poison had worked its way through my system for days, leaving me feeling like I'd been hit by a truck, even with the dwarven healer's interventions. "Need a hand there, Lopez?" Jennings materialized beside me, already reaching for the complicated array of buckles and straps. He'd been doing that a lot lately, appearing whenever I so much as winced. It had been a surprising revelation, but after watching me getting dragged out of the arena after the final trial, I guess I must have had the whole team spooked, especially given that O'Malley hadn't made it. "This gear is way too small," he muttered, yanking on a stubborn strap that refused to meet its buckle. "You sure you're up for this?" I nodded, not trusting my voice as he helped secure the heavy breastplate. When the last piece finally clicked into place, I took a deep breath, feeling the weight settle on my shoulders. The prospect of standing through an entire feast made my leg ache in anticipation, but the dwarven army uniform was compulsory for the presentation, and after all I'd been through, I wasn't about to skip the ceremony now. "Bah! You start with the greaves and work your way up." Thordis bumped Jennings out of the way with a cluck and reached for the plates remaining on the bench. "To think you spindly humans have become the center of the realms and cannot strap on simple armor." My lips twisted in a smirk as the dwarf got to work strapping the plates to my legs while Jennings glowered down at her. Without a broadband comms device in the room and our own gear secured in crates, Jennings was left to interpret Thordis's words through body language. It still felt nice to piece together Dwarven without relying on translators, though I figured it was a skill that would soon become redundant if the feast signaled the end of the trade talks. I thanked Thordis as she finished helping me, and the dwarf simply clapped my arm and resumed pacing the armory with her comrades. We weren't exactly friendly after completing the final trial, but both she and Durgan checked on me in the dwarven hospital after I'd come round. Durgan had even brought some baked goods from his mother, which I'd politely nibbled and set aside as soon as the visit was over. Apparently, the quality of hospital food was a universal truth across the multiverse. I joined my team, who waited to be called into the Great Hall. Gunther and Lewis sat awkwardly in their armor on stone benches, while Jennings shifted from foot to foot, occasionally pulling at a strap which was too tight on account of his 6.5 feet. The rest of the AFOs, the 10 out of 12 who had made it through all 3 trials, were similarly waiting it out in huddles. It seemed a little sad that after almost 6 months we were still the outsiders from Fort Hood. The heavy doors swung open and Jorman's gravelly voice called us forward. Captain Morales herded us into formation as we filed into the grand hall, our armor clanking with each step. My thigh burned, but I focused on maintaining the precise spacing between myself and Lewis as we took our positions. The hall stretched before us, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows far above. The same strange ambient light I remembered from our first visit emanated from nowhere and everywhere at once, casting a warm glow across polished armor and ceremonial weapons, making them gleam as if alive with their own inner fire. King Modsvarta Yarnkrona sat at the center of the high table, his crown catching the light as he leaned in to speak with General Rind. The sight of Earth's military commander seated beside the dwarven High King struck me as surreal, even if it was for the second time now. Ambassador Benson and Colonel Monk were scattered among the bordering nobles, their human forms conspicuous among the shorter, broader frames of the dwarven leadership. I noticed Benson still practicing her diplomatic magic as she spoke with a dwarven lady, who managed to look down at her despite being noticeably shorter. The usual aromas of roasted meat were notably absent. No platters lined the long tables, no servants bustled between benches with pitchers of Durmalth. This wasn't the feast. Not yet, at least. King Yarnkrona rose, and the hall fell silent. His deep voice carried effortlessly through the space as he announced that Brokadrotin Eldrjalmr would present the new warriors who had proved themselves worthy through the Berghald trials. I drew in a steadying breath as Firehelm approached the front of the hall, his rust-red beard gleaming with ceremonial rings. Behind him walked Grimir, and I no longer flinched at his seemingly precarious movement. The eye that had once unnerved me now held only wisdom. My pulse quickened as they took their positions before the king. This was it, the moment that would determine if all we'd endured had been worth it. Was it stupid to be nervous? We'd passed the trials. This was just the pomp and ceremony to confirm what we already knew. But my stomach bubbled anyway. I'd spent the better part of the time I'd been in the infirmary wondering what the ceremony would involve. I stand before you as the Brokadrotin of Azagrim, tasked with testing the mettle of all those who would stand in our ranks. Firehelm's fist struck his chest plate. I have presided over the Berghald trials and present those who have endured them to you this night. These warriors have proven themselves in the deepest dark. They have shown both brawn and brains. But most importantly, they have shown they can fight as one with their brothers and sisters in arms. I ask you now, are they worthy to stand in Azagrim's great army? The response was immediate and thunderous. Hundreds of dwarven voices, mostly those in the standing space at the back, shouted their approval. The sound reverberated off the stone walls until I could feel it in my bones. But as the clamor died down, I noticed several members of the boardring remained conspicuously silent. King Svarthak of Berakar in particular seemed to be trying to burn holes through Firehelm with his glare. My stomach clenched. After everything we'd been through, was this ceremony about to devolve into some kind of diplomatic incident? But King Yarnkrona only gave a small frown before nodding to Firehelm to continue. Firehelm gestured to Grimir, who shuffled forward. The craftsman held up one of the metal bands we'd all been wearing throughout our training, the one that had been gone once I woke up in the infirmary. Every warrior is unique, Grimir's voice carried clearly despite its age-worn rasp. While we must fight as one, we each bring our own strengths and face our own limitations. These bands have witnessed your trials, measured your movements, and felt your responses to challenge and threat. I blinked, catching Lewis doing the same beside me. Our bands had been collecting combat data, testing us. Through them, I have crafted enchanted weapons that will be more than mere tools, Grimmer continued as several apprentices began wheeling forward cloth-covered carts. They will be extensions of yourselves, companions matched perfectly to your individual fighting styles. I had to keep my mouth from falling open. I knew we'd each be presented with a weapon, but enchanted by a master craftsman? Just for us? I had to wonder where the old guy had found the time while he'd been lurking at our training sessions every day. The presentation seemed to stretch endlessly as Grimir called each warrior forward. I watched as dwarves received their weapons, beautifully crafted pieces that seemed to hum with power even from where I stood. Some claimed massive warhammers that looked too heavy to lift, yet their new owners handled them easily. Others received axes with edges that caught the light in ways that made my eyes water. Each recipient shared the same transformation, approaching with formal stoicism only to return with expressions of wonder that made them look decades younger. Thordis practically floated back to her position, a throwing hammer spinning between her fingers as if it had always belonged there. My thigh screamed for relief as I shifted my weight as subtly as possible. Lewis caught my eye with a concerned glance, but I gave him a discreet wave of dismissal. I wasn't about to show weakness now, not when we were so close. Finally, Grimir began calling the AFOs forward. Gunther received a longsword, its surface rippling with strange patterns. Lewis earned himself a wicked-looking curved blade that seemed to drink in the light around it. Asha Lopez. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, carefully measuring my stride to hide my limp. The stone floor seemed to stretch forever between my position and where Grimir waited, his good eye fixed on me with uncomfortable intensity. When I reached him, he lifted a cloth-wrapped bundle from the cart. As the fabric fell away, I caught my breath. The sword was beautiful in its simplicity, an edged blade with subtle runes etched along its length that somehow drew the eye without being gaudy. Grimir leaned close as he presented it to me, his voice for my ears alone. This is Erding, forged with the power of lightning itself. His good eye twinkled. A fitting blade for a warrior who knows the value of patience, who waits for precisely the right moment to strike. I wrapped my fingers around the hilt, and a jolt ran up my arm. The sword felt like an extension of my own body, perfectly balanced and humming with potential energy, like a storm waiting to break. I may very well have floated back to the formation myself, and it seemed cruel that I had to buckle Erding at my side and wait out the feast instead of scurrying away to fawn over my new prize. But there were others still waiting, and after securing the weapon, I had to settle with resting my hand on the pommel which still tingled at the enchantment. I watched as King Jarnkrona rose again, his ceremonial rings glimmering as he spread his arms wide. The hall fell silent once more, though I noticed several of the bordering members shifting restlessly in their seats. King Svartak's scowl had only deepened during the weapons presentation. The High King's voice rolled through the chamber as he spoke of unity between realms and the strength found in diversity. Fine words, but they seemed to land differently across the gathered crowd. While the General Assembly nodded along, the tension at the high table was palpable. When he gestured for Lord Dromander and Ambassador Benson to step forward, I couldn't help noticing how Queen Hildren's fingers tightened around her goblet. The two diplomats moved to their positions side by side, but something in Benson's carefully neutral expression set off warning bells in my head. She was concerned. My hand remained on Erding's pommel, drawing comfort from its electric hum as Dromander spoke. The dwarf's rich baritone filled the hall, his precise dwarven carrying clearly to every corner and echoing English into our minds. He spoke of months of careful negotiations, of bridges built between our peoples, of technological exchange that would benefit both Earth and the Dwaringall planets. When he finished, Ambassador Benson stepped forward with her characteristic poise. The torchlight caught the silver in her hair as she smiled at the gathered crowd. She offered salutations, first in carefully pronounced Dwaran and then switching to English. Honored King Jarn Krona, esteemed members of the board ring, Earth stands before you today with profound gratitude, she said, her voice steady and measured. As we sign these accords, we pledge not just trade, but beneficence, a commitment to nurture this relationship between our peoples for generations to come. Gromwald. It came as a hiss from behind me, and I turned to catch Durgan's face mottling red with rage as he spoke to a male dwarf at his side. She dares to speak of Gromwald to us? Oh, shit. I swallowed and looked into the crowd, where similar glares were mirrored among the seated dwarven nobles muttering among themselves. I couldn't exactly blame them, and cast back to which word must have translated wrong. For the first time in 6 months, the unflappable mask Ambassador Benson wore like armor slid from her face in confusion. Then, a distinct thunk of a goblet being slammed down on the table propelled me into action. Stepping out of the formation, I cast around a little frantically for Reed and found him gaping from the sidelines. Uncaring that I was breaking protocol, I made a dash for him as the room erupted in furious Dwaran. When I reached the diplomatic aide, he'd already moved to head toward Benson, but I caught the sleeve of his shirt. Gromwald, I said. Something's gone wrong with the translator. It's how dwarves refer to races like gnomes. Their right to rule over them as a lesser species. Reed's eyes sharpened and he tugged at his tie. I could practically see the wheels turning in his mind. Gromwald. Beneficence? Shit. Stay right there. I honestly didn't think I had ever used the word beneficence in a sentence my entire life. Damn political speak. But that was beside the point. I swallowed as I surveyed the room, and some of the board ring members now standing openly and pointing at the table. But Reed threaded his way past guards and slipped in beside Benson to whisper furiously into her ear. Morales was close enough to catch whatever he was saying, and for a moment our eyes met when he glanced across at me. Yeah, screw you too for thinking that I was betraying my country for learning Dwaran from a gnome. Benson nodded, her features pale but her eyes dawning with understanding. She turned to raise her hands to the room, but I doubted anyone was going to give her the airtime to speak. Then King Jarn Krona stood and bellowed for silence. I watched as Ambassador Benson drew herself up, her diplomatic mask firmly back in place. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly despite lingering murmurs of discontent. I offer my deepest apologies for the incorrect translation, she said. Let me be clear. Earth approaches Dwarringall not as benefactors, but as equals. We seek partnership, not patronage. Her eyes found mine in the crowd, and there was a question in them. But it wasn't like the translators spat English into Dwaran for us humans, and my heart hammered as I stepped forward, trying to intuit from the faces in the crowd whether the words had been enough. The weight of Erding at my hip felt oddly comforting as hundreds of eyes followed the ambassador's gaze toward me. Speaking Dwaran before the assembled court wasn't exactly part of my security detail duties, but then again, neither was preventing a diplomatic incident. Brothers and sisters in arms, I began slowly in Dwaran, my voice steadier than I felt. We who have fought in the depths together know the truth. There is no higher or lower between us. We are warriors who have bled together, fought together, as equals. It is my honor to stand in Azagrim's great army. The tension in the room slowly dissipated like mist in the morning sun. I caught several of the board ring members settling back into their seats, their earlier anger fading to mere discontent. Even King Svarthak's scowl had softened somewhat. I wasn't sure Earth would ever win them over, but then again, we wouldn't need to if we managed to close the gates between our worlds. King Jarn Krona's rich laugh broke through the remaining silence. Well spoken, young warrior. Indeed, Let us begin that feast now." He raised his goblet high. "Bring forth the food and drink. Let us celebrate new bonds forged in honor." The great doors swung wide as gnomish servers began streaming in with laden platters. The familiar aroma of roasted dwarven fare filled the air, and the sound of conversation gradually returned to normal levels. As I made my way back to my position, Ambassador Benson caught my eye again and gave me a small but genuine smile of gratitude. My leg was screaming for rest, but at least now I could look forward to sitting down and pretending to partake of the dwarven hospitality. For as long as strictly necessary before I could return to surface camp and truly get acquainted with my new sword anyway. "If you take eyes off sword, it not sneak away," Gotha said. I lifted my head to give the gnome a flat stare, my fingers resting on the blade balanced in my lap. I had to admit I had a propensity to stare at the enchanted weapon, even now that my leg was much better and I'd had opportunities to get into the arena with it during the training hour. "I'm aware," I said tartly. The gnome dissolved into a fit of laughter and set down a pair of pliers. She held up the Velimir, now fitted with a simple chain to wear as a necklace, and the pendant gleamed under the morning Azagrim sun. "Is ready." She gave a toothy grin as she scurried around the table to fix it around my neck. My hand went up to touch it, the bands of metal wire enveloping it like a basket bumpy against my fingertips. It didn't feel magical, but I didn't want to share my apprehension with the gnome who had spent so much time crafting it. "Thank you." I reached for my pack to fish out the lodestone pellets I'd hoarded over the past weeks. "It's not much, but this should tide your people over for a while. Once trade opens up, I hope it'll be easier to get your hands on some." The gnome took the bag and bowed low, then waved a hand with a chitter. "Is okay. Gnome's resourceful. Already lodestones give enough to power bigger Velimir. Is back and forth. Self-sustain?" I blinked. "You used the lodestones to create a self-perpetuating battery?" "Yes." Gotha lifted a finger with a gleeful expression. "Drain magic is waste. Gnomes know this, and find way to make more magic." Huh. I found my shoulders had loosened and my lips had quirked upward. I guess scarcity is the mother of invention. Gotha frowned at that, but then shook her head in a way that suggested humans were too difficult to reckon with. Gnomes as inventors. Gnomes will always find way to thrive. "I'm glad," I said. "So what will you use those for, then?" "Already we share with other tribes. These go further to make more gnomish dens abundant in food. Is gnome way?" Gotha shrugged as though that much was obvious. "I think humans might have a thing or two to learn from your people," I said, fitting Erding back into its sheath. "And dwarves, for that matter." Yes. Gotha scratched at the halo of frizzy hair around her head and plucked something out of the tangle before inspecting it, then popping it into her mouth. "Gnomes is wise. All races should know this. How long before humans depart for Earth?" I ignored my instinct to grimace at whatever Gotha had been cultivating in her hair as food. "It will be soon. A week at most, I think. Some will be stationed here on the surface as long as the trade deal holds, but the ambassador and our team will head home." "To Fort Hood, Texas?" Gotha said the words carefully, like she had committed them to memory some time ago. "Yeah. One day, Gotha may venture to your Texas and see marvels of human world. Gotha will pay respect while there, and perhaps you offer hospitality." My eyes bugged out a little as I imagined the gnome sleeping on the couch in my shitty one-bedroom apartment. My neighbor Mrs. Lee would have a fit. But after all the gnome had done for me, I couldn't find it in myself to say no. Instead, I told myself it was highly unlikely that she would find her way from the Dwarangal Gate in Georgia to Lampasas to look me up. After offering assurances that I would enjoy a visit, I farewelled the gnome to leave for the surface camp, possibly for the last time. I had kept the scant visits with her short and sweet since being reprimanded, but I figured after the feast people like Morales and Reed couldn't be too uppity about them if they found out. The trade talks were done. The trials were done. Mission accomplished. As I strode back across the barren landscape toward the geodesic dome with the weight of Erding at my side and the Velimir dangling around my neck, I finally felt the sense of completion which had been out of reach since arriving on this alien world, of hope, for a future where we could drive back the elves long enough to deal with the real calamity of the interdimensional gates littered all across Earth, for things to go back to normal. Because one day I hoped that this trip to Azagrim would feel like an impossible dream, rather than a memory. I gripped Erding's pommel. Okay, so perhaps an impossible dream with a couple of keepsakes. Thank you for listening to Erding, the prequel novella in the War for Magic series. I hope you enjoyed the story of how Asha got her enchanted sword, and if you want to hear about how she puts it to use, stick around for the first 3 chapters in The Elf Captive. If you're already sold, check out the link in the description to listen to The Elf Captive right away here on YouTube. Chapter 1. As we approached the gates of Fort Hood, lightning crackled in the sky, striking the arcane shield that protected the base. The barrier flashed momentarily, lighting up the landscape before returning to its invisible state. As I watched the violent storm rage overhead from the back seat, I wondered if I was desperate enough for a shower to risk dancing in the rain at night during a storm. Despite the tumultuous weather, the sight of home base made me sigh a little wistfully, after a demanding ascent from the depths of the dwarf homeworld, and a 12-hour drive in the back of a jeep with 3 other stinky soldiers from my security detail. The dream of cleanliness was tantalizingly close. The guards waved us through the checkpoint, and I knew that soon home would be within reach. "We're home, yeah!" Jennings smacked the top of the car and whooped as we passed the gate. "I'm gonna get me a pizza, some beer, and somebody to squeeze. You with me, Lewis?" Lewis chuckled from the passenger seat and thumped Jennings on the arm. "You got your priorities wrong. I've got my girl waiting on me, and I'm not fool enough to scarf a 6-pack and a pizza before seeing to her." "If she's still waiting after 6 months," Jennings scoffed and threw a look over his shoulder. "What about you, Lopez? You squeeze me, I squeeze you?" "Squeeze yourself," I said, and shared a look with Gunther, who rolled his eyes. The peanut gallery in front laughed, but I stared out the window at the long stretch of asphalt between the gates and the compound. A gleaming line of pearl-white headlights and taillights moved about. It was hard to tell in the dark, but the base vehicles seemed busier than normal. A lot might have happened since I last reported in. I hoped it didn't bode ill for the soldiers at Avant. I was surprised to find Colonel Levine standing with his arms folded in front of the barracks when Jennings pulled in. I wasn't expecting to report in until the morning, and glanced at my watch, batting away a wave of irritation. As an officer who chose to live off base, I still had at least half an hour after finding my car to get home to Lampasas, and I knew Mrs. Lee would thump the wall between our apartments if I had the shower running after midnight. "Well, looky here," he called over the rain hammering the base as we climbed out of the jeep with our packs. "Hope you caught some sleep on the drive back. I've got fresh orders and not enough AFOs on the ground, especially ones with dwarven steel." I gritted my teeth and slung my pack over my shoulder, hustling to get under cover. There were never enough Adept Forces officers on the ground. If there was trouble at the Avant Gate, another 4 officers wouldn't turn the tide. But Colonel Levine grinned and clapped his hands, erupting with laughter at his own joke. "Gotcha good. You get 1 night's sleep before you get reassigned. Use it wisely." The guys groaned and shouldered their packs to leave for the barracks. Only Gunther troubled himself to wave goodbye, and I waited for them to trudge away before turning back to the colonel. He still wore a cheesy grin, and looking around to see if we were alone, I poked him in the ribs. "Was that necessary?" "You know it was, Asha." He gave me a sidelong look at my impudence, but didn't chastise me. In the morning, they'll be glad I gave them an extra 12 hours before their next assignment. You, on the other hand, can accompany me back to my office. I arched an eyebrow, waiting for him to crack up again, but he only turned on his heel and strode off, leaving me to follow with a groan. For a guy built like a house, he moved fast on long legs, and he knew I had to hustle to keep up. I really wasn't in the mood for poring over the minutia about my posting to Ambassador Benson's security detail, but I knew that he'd want the unofficial account of the biggest deal brokered off-world since the gates opened 15 years ago. Really? I lengthened my stride on legs that felt like lead to fall into step beside him. We don't get a week off before heading back to the lines? Half a year on special assignment doesn't qualify? When was the last time anyone gave an AFO a week off? Colonel Levine shook his head, his strong jaw set. Hell, I can't remember the last time I had a week off. Maybe the Arcane Special Forces afforded more privilege to its officers than regular infantry, but it was true that the work was relentless. But Hank Levine had been a soldier long before the night the gates opened on Earth, and even if he was a hard-ass military man, I owed him my life. I rubbed my grainy eyes as we continued into the colonel's office block. You're drained. He stopped a soldier heading in the opposite direction to bark an order for 2 coffees to be delivered to his desk, with his secretary Denise no doubt having long left the office. The private in question scurried off with a yes, sir, while eyeing my pack with a frown. By the morning, your magic reserves should be replenished. If not, we'll get you a lodestone to charge up. Levine's office was much as I remembered it, stark, furnished sparely, with magical devices in secure display cases on his chipped melamine desk taking pride of place. The only personal item in the room was an engraved bottle of champagne on a shelf, a gift from his wife a few years back for his last promotion, which he swore not to open until he retired. I knew Lorraine was counting the days until that particular toast. She'd already lost so much in the war, but then again, we all had. If you're after all the sordid details, you'll be disappointed. I sighed as I dropped onto a molded plastic chair in front of the desk. Ambassador Benson kept us out of the negotiation room. Her people took the rotation to watch her back in the Great Hall. We were the overqualified bodyguards that shadowed her after hours. Huh. Levine barked a laugh. And you think that earns you a week off? I'm not surprised, though. Colonel Monk keeps his cards close. It was his operation from the start, and if he had more AFOs at his disposal, he would never have agreed to bring on officers outside of his unit. I pursed my lips, uninterested in army politics, which shifted like quicksand as more powerful magic users ascended ranks. I thought Benson might demand we turn in our swords the minute we got home. She called ahead, actually. I understand those were diplomatic gifts, and the dwarves are likely to get a bug up their ass if we don't honor them as such. What's your assessment of them? I tugged the sword loose from my pack, knowing how sharp the edges were and hoping it didn't cleave the sheath in two. The dwarves still scoffed at our preference for one-handed weapons, but as our training with their weapons masters had progressed, they agreed that our physiques were better suited to agility and speed, rather than blunt force and endless endurance. Each one is different, based on the weapons master's observations of our skills. I smoothed my hand over the runes etched on the flat of the blade, which tingled with an audible crackle. Mine is infused with lightning. Levine let out a whistle and beckoned with his hand. I passed the blade over reluctantly. He touched the runes gingerly, and a spark shot out, causing him to snatch his hand away from the blade and keep his grip on the handle. Because of your striking demeanor, I suppose? I snorted. Dwarven Firehelm said I was as prickly as one of their native fruits. Sounds about right, Levine muttered as he inspected the runes under the fluorescent light. I don't know how much use you'll get out of this manning the gates, but you should count yourself lucky. The general wasn't impressed about the number of lodestones that went into the deal at the briefing, and it'll take years to outfit the entire army with enough guns using dwarven alloys. If this thing wasn't enchanted, I imagine they would have tossed it in the furnace to speed up production. My breath caught as I took back Erding and hastened to resheath it. Luckily, the private sent to collect coffee interrupted what I supposed would have been a jibe on Levine's part at my show of possessiveness. I wasn't the sentimental type, but damn it, I'd earned that blade. Levine gave the private a hard stare as he hurried to bring 2 battered tin mugs over and remained silent until he'd backed away and left in a hurry. I see the coffee hasn't improved since I left. I made a face as I took a tentative sip. Beans are hard to come by. Levine shrugged as he took a healthy gulp, like he was oblivious to its rocket fuel aftertaste. I placed my mug back on the desk with a shudder. So, if you're not after information, what did you need to speak to me about? Levine ran his tongue over his teeth and gave me an appraising look before standing to fetch a tablet. How many languages do you speak, Lopez? I frowned. Spanish, French, and English, fluently. And I hear you picked up a good amount of dwarven on your trip off-world. I narrowed my eyes, his nonchalant tone making me wary. I'm conversational in their trade dialect, the common tongue, so to speak. It's not like I could read a newspaper over there. They have those? I heard paper was scarce, even in the latrines. Don't remind me. I made a face, but strange bathroom customs aside, I wasn't going to let him get me off balance. If you're after a dwarven interpreter, get a linguist on the job. I'm not in any rush to go back through a gate. It's already organized as part of the deal. No, Ambassador Benson called me personally to commend your efforts. I hear nobody on the team picked up the lingo quicker than you, and she suggested you be reassigned to Georgia. I refused. I took a measured breath, grateful yet wary. I appreciate it. You didn't enjoy your tour? The work was fine, but Benson seemed more interested in making trade deals than collaborating on closing the gates. I heard nothing to suggest it was even on the agenda. Small steps. Levine punched the tablet with his finger. We need firepower first, and China is already ahead of the game on that front. I refrained from grinding my teeth. Humanity had enough on its plate without Earth politics clouding the primary goal. Shut the gates, saving what was left of this rock. But we're here to discuss your new assignment. The General agreed it should be yours, given your skill set. I don't know if you heard, but we received an invitation for peace talks from Arendor last month. I took a sharp breath. The elves want to talk peace? I didn't believe it either, but I took the message from the Avant Gate myself. And according to the EA, they've extended the invitation to Russia, who intends to represent the East. You're kidding. I blinked, trying to connect that piece of news to my apparent skill set. Of course, this was bigger than the US. This had to rate as the most significant issue for the Earthen Alliance since the gates opened. And you want me on that detail? Levine stood a little straighter. I'll be heading up the unit that accompanies General Rind through the gate, and you're going with me. While the Alliance is meeting to discuss the talks, I'll send Jennings and Lewis directly to the General. I'm handling the negotiations with the elven dignitaries at the gates about their terms. No wonder it's a hive of activity here, I muttered. The General is going through in person? The elves would settle for nothing less. Once Russia agreed, it became a pissing contest. Levine slurped more coffee. The talks are in 3 months, and I'm keeping you back to work on something that could give us an edge. I cocked my head, waiting for him to elaborate. Dwarven translation devices are one thing, but even they're notoriously picky with Elvish. If there's anything that the Alliance agrees on, it's that we shouldn't put all our faith in magical devices created off-world. In hostile territory, even more so. We need operatives who can read the room and hear what the translators miss. I frowned. Isn't intelligence working on that kind of thing? Sure. But from what we know, there are hundreds of Elvish dialects across their worlds, and the elves are being cagey about the location of the meat. We can't take a squadron of linguists with us on the off chance one of them will understand what those pointy ear freaks say. Besides, they'll stick out like sore thumbs. So you want me to take tuition from intelligence on a language with a bunch of dialects for 3 months? Even better. Levine set the tablet on the desk in front of him. You're going to learn from a direct source. Blinking, I held up the tablet and peered at a mugshot. The image showed a figure with long white blonde hair, sharp, angular features, and intense green eyes. It was a face that might have belonged to any of the hundreds of elves I'd encountered on battlefields at first glance. But there was something about his penetrating gaze, the determined set of the jaw, that made this particular elf stand out. It was like he was staring right back at me somehow. Maybe because I only ever got up close with elves who were either dead on the battlefield or trying to kill me. They come in for mugshots now. I assumed the elf in question was from one of the settlements across the border. Why would one of their colonies help us? They won't. Levine's voice was flat. This one we picked up near a forced gate 10 miles from Encino. I had to tear my eyes away from the tablet before setting it on the desk. The Mexican military hadn't made it a priority to clear out the elves living in their borders, if that was even possible, and a group had set up a permanent camp in dense forested country north of Monterrey. The Mexican general negotiated a deal with the U.S. for access to the surrounding countryside in exchange for aid. It had been a bone of contention for years. Why would he open a gate outside of the colony? Our best guess is that he misfired. We haven't been able to get him to talk, and the colonists have doubled down on their security. We haven't been able to open a dialogue with them about this guy's identity. Confused, I screwed up my face. How long have you had this guy? 6 weeks. The muscles in Levine's jaw flexed. I've got the general breathing down my neck for progress reports daily. No wonder, I breathed. How long's the record? The UK reported holding a female for 9 days a couple of years back. They kept her under constant watch, but when a guard let his attention slide, she grabbed his gun and took out everyone in the room, then her own life before he could blink. Of all the races, elves were by far the biggest mystery to Earth. The fact that they all went kamikaze the moment we captured them didn't help matters. 6 weeks of captivity was nothing short of a miracle. I folded my arms. And you want me to learn his language? Levine's eyebrows climbed his forehead. Are you questioning orders, Lopez? No, sir, just waiting for you to get to the point. This elf is too big of a deal globally to be utilized as a tutor. Normally I'd agree, but as it stands, we need an AFO on the ground who speaks the right language when we're off-world. And right now, he isn't giving anything up to the folks brought in by the general. Is that so? My eyes narrowed. There was something else. There had to be. I'm just a soldier, Hank. I don't have any fancy degrees or training as an interrogator. My only experience with elves has been on the business end of a blaster. Fancy degrees are in short supply these days, and there's no handbook on the subject of interrogating elves. Maybe we need some fresh perspective, given the lack of results by these so-called professionals. He grimaced. But what I need is someone I can trust with sights on the SOB who reports directly to me. Right now, we haven't even gotten a name from him. I told the general that if this guy won't tell us what we want to know, putting another subject on the table might help us build some rapport with him. Rapport? My lip curled. Me? Colonel Levine retrieved a manila folder from a drawer in his desk. After dropping it in front of me, he steepled his fingers like he was really enjoying watching me squirm. But a faint crease formed between his brows. His usual straight posture seemed slightly hunched, and his shoulders were tense, betraying an underlying tension. I'd known him for long enough to tell when he was putting on a brave face. And despite the assignment sounding about as fun as a sharp stick in the eye, I had faith in the man to have my back. Like he had ever since he found me after the gates opened as a terrified teenager in the middle of the apocalypse. Yes, you, it should be a cinch, with all that charm of yours. Rolling my eyes, I stood and scooped up the folder. Sure. People tell me how charming I am all the time. Colonel Levine grinned from ear to ear. Good. Dismissed. If anyone had told me back on Azagrim that I'd return to an Earth turned upside down with peace talks and elf captives, I'd have told them they were crazy. Standing, I gave a nod to the colonel and turned to leave the office. I wasn't sure how I felt about it all, but thought a decent night's sleep and a hot shower would help make sense of the situation. In a senseless world, there were only a few things that we held on to. Elves were the enemy, and one day things would get back to normal. Well, as normal as they could be anyway. Chapter 2. If the first shower after I'd gotten home was good, the one in the morning was amazing. Having sluiced off the grime and otherworldly dirt the night before, I took my time lathering my hair with real shampoo and stayed under the spray until the water ran cold. Water that didn't reek of minerals and leave your skin with a rusty layer of iron slime like the natural baths in Azagrim. My hair smelled like tropical flowers, not sulfur. Still, it took Mrs. Lee banging on the wall to get me out once the boiler was empty. After getting dressed and enjoying my first non-MRE meal in months, a granola bar from the back of the cupboard, which I hoped was still in date, my neighbor once again started banging, this time on the door. I rubbed the bridge of my nose, less because of Mrs. Lee and more about having my first proper alone time interrupted before 8 a.m. Mrs. Lee, I smiled politely as I answered the door. If it's about the water... The elderly woman shook her head and tutted as she pushed past me into the apartment. No warm wash today. The fabrics I'm sewing are delicate. No, I figure you back, so I come to warn you. Oh? I arched an eyebrow and closed the door. There wasn't a lot of room for entertaining in my one-bedroom dwelling, but Mrs. Lee pulled up a stool at the folding card table which served as my dining suite. Lampasas has become overrun. Last week, soldiers come and say they requisition building, waved paper in my face and tell me to leave. I frowned, trying to imagine anyone telling Mrs. Lee to do anything she didn't want to do. As I stuck a kettle on the stove, she continued. But I'm too clever for them. She tapped her temple with an impish grin. I take papers, which say they can only take if building not lived in by family, so you should get a roommate before they come back. A roommate in a one-bedroom apartment? I opened a tea canister and sniffed the contents before dumping a spoonful in a teapot. The only reason your stuff isn't on lawn is because I say you AFO and chop their balls off if they dare. They say they check with their superior officer and come back. My lips twisted into a smirk. Less about the threat than imagining Mrs. Lee delivering it to a couple of junior officers. How'd you scare them away from your place? Too clever, like I said. I have new roommate, a crafty one who help with sewing machines. Crafty? I poured from the kettle. Tell me this roommate of yours isn't a... Yes. Giggit is gnome. But he clean, and you be nice to him. Already he helping with many orders. I wasn't sure if it was necessary for the woman to invite a gnome into her apartment to keep the army off her back. As it stood, I was sure that the colonel would have insisted she be left alone if he knew about it, less as a gesture of goodwill and more about keeping the woman off base. As a magic adept over combat age, she was still conscripted to serve in whatever way she could. After a long and tedious battle, the seamstress had come to an arrangement where her contribution was as a tailor to the army, infusing garments with magical protections. If you want, I can talk to Colonel Levine about it. I'm sure you don't have to keep sharing your apartment. You can drop the gnome back where you found him. Nup. She shook her head as I handed her a chipped mug. Giggit is clean. He living under bridge but now have honest work with me. He stays. If Mrs. Lee wanted to keep the gnome, I wasn't about to stop her. In principle, I wanted all off-worlders gone, but that didn't mean I harbored malicious intent toward all the races. So long as he stayed the hell out of my apartment and didn't start dismantling my car for parts, I was prepared to be a respectable neighbor while the gates stayed open. Well, if he starts thieving or giving you grief, let me know, okay? I've dealt with my fair share of gnomes over the past 6 months. Azagrim! Mrs. Lee's eyes brightened and she leaned forward. You must tell me all about it. Is dwarven tailoring superior to ours? Nothing compares to your outfits, I said with a smirk as I sat across from her and took a sip of tea. They mostly wear fire-retardant leather with an overabundance of buckles. Very fine buckles, yes? Of course. But I don't have much to tell, really. I was stuck doing security. We weren't permitted to go running off into their cities. I spent most of my free time on the surface. The dwarves didn't care if we went up there. To see the gnomish? I eyed my neighbor askance. Before that morning, I couldn't remember her even talking about gnomes in passing conversation. To see the sun, Mrs. Lee, and the stars. Mrs. Lee's mouth parted and she sagged in her seat theatrically. They have on Dwaringal World? You look like you have more tan. I rolled up my sleeve and shrugged. My skin was already an olive shade, but getting a tan wasn't on my list of priorities. I might have picked up some color, though. They have 3 sons. By mid-afternoon, it's too hot to even think about going up there. But in the mornings, I closed my eyes a little wistfully, remembering the warmth on my skin. It was everything I remember and more. While I was on the surface, I bartered with some gnomes for lessons in dwarven. If you can keep them on task, they aren't bad teachers. Mrs. Lee pursed her lips and nodded in approval. So you are gnomish sympathizer, then? I don't know about that, but they aren't so bad, I guess. Especially on their homeworld, where they didn't resort to thievery, with dwarves around to keep them in line. When you're firm with them. Yes, not good on the concentration. Mrs. Lee slapped her forehead. You must give them tasks to do. They are most helpful when making things. I reached for my pendant but let my hand drop before fishing it out from my shirt. As a parting gift, a gnome by the name of Gotha had crafted the Velimir for me. She'd told me it would be at least as good as a lodestone on Earth, which was why I was reluctant to show it to anyone. She'd spent every minute while giving me lessons working on it, which I'd come to learn was the only way to keep her focused. What about here, though? Do you know about the situation with the elves? Mrs. Lee's features twisted and she took a small sip of tea. Everyone knows. The TV promised a time of great fortune and peace. Everybody lap it up like suckers. It's got out that far? My eyebrows climbed in genuine surprise. I would have thought they'd keep it hush-hush until the deal was solid. Too much whisper after Russia declare their marshal visit Great Elven City and make wedding arrangement with one of their princesses. They had no choice but to declare second expedition from Texas. No marriage, though. You've got to be kidding me! My jaw dropped in disgust. An arranged marriage? During a ceasefire? Doesn't the marshal's wife object to that? Hell, don't the Russian citizens object to that? They say once peace deal brokered, they marry. Marshal's wife give interview in magazine. Say she making sacrifice for noble cause. Mrs. Lee shrugged and leaned in a little closer. You ask me? She's sick of staring at husband's fat bald head. Perhaps she has eyes on a handsome elf too, eh? I shook my head, refusing to dwell on the motivations of the Russian marshal or his wife. What happened to restoring the Earth and closing the portals? Does this feel like the kind of gesture a planet makes toward severing all ties? And more importantly, gates that keep us from spending the next few centuries at war? Mrs. Lee reached over the table, her eyes softening, and clasped my hand. You clever, but you stupid sometimes. Things change in 15 years. Too much water under bridge. I know how you feel if Mr. Lee was never... She paused and choked back a sob. Closing gates won't bring him back. It won't bring anyone's family back either. Too much commerce now depends on magic. It will be just as bad, if not worse, if gates close. Already they talk of great elven magic restoring the weather and the seasons and banishing bad skies. Not that I believe such nonsense. I pulled my hand back. If even Mrs. Lee, whose life was as broken as mine by the interrealm gates, was coming around to some ridiculous ideal of living in harmony with the other worlds, things were worse than I thought. Sure, talk of ending the war long enough to turn our full attention toward the gates themselves had always been a counter-argument in what remained of Earth's media. But even so, this sounded a step well beyond that. Nothing will go back to normal until magic is a figment of our imagination again, I said, gripping my mug. You really want society to go on as it is? Even if we see martial law lifted in our lifetimes, we'll be living in a magical caste system forever. Mrs. Lee snorted. Is always big people and little people as long as humans exist. And big people have magic now. Genie not go back in the bottle and cannot unscramble egg. Magic is here to stay. The words felt like I'd been slapped in the face with a rubber band. My hands shook slightly as I set down the mug, rattling it against the table. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but it was too late. The memories were already flooding back, unbidden and unwanted. Flashes of dust and smoke filled my mind. the acrid scent of burning buildings and bodies filling my nostrils. Screams echoed in my ears, distant and muffled as if underwater. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the images away, but they persisted. My chest tightened and the sting of tears threatened to spill over. No, not here. Not now. I couldn't let Mrs. Lee see me like this. I forced myself to take another deep breath, focusing on the warmth of the mug in my hands, the faint scent of tea, the solid presence of the table beneath my elbows. Slowly, the memories began to recede, fading into the dark recesses of my mind where I kept them locked away. "Asha, you okay?" Mrs. Lee's voice cut through the haze, concern etched into her features. "So we'd have to upset the food chain again," I snapped. "So what? We've done it once, and we can do it again, without magic." Mrs. Lee scoffed and stood to pat my shoulder. If she wasn't as old as my grandparents would have been by now, I would have taken it as an insult. Instead, I glared out the window at the ever-present storm clouds which obscured the sun. Never parting even for a minute since the gates had opened, the effect had been devastating to the environment. If people thought elves could skip on over and wish them away, then it wasn't me being naive. "I must go," Mrs. Lee said softly. "There are many orders to fulfill, but it is quiet at the Avant Gate. Even with much to do, I hope your colonel has seen fit to give you a chance to recuperate after your adventure." I was about to correct her on that point when she turned to leave. After hoping to snatch a couple of hours to myself that morning before starting my assignment, it was clear I had a lot of catching up to do. I let Mrs. Lee out with a promise to come and greet her gnome later and stared at my pack, where the manila folder from Levine remained bunched next to dirty laundry and the sheath of my new sword. If given the choice, I would have spurned the assignment and laundry to go and seek someone to spar with to blow off some steam. But I doubted that would fly with the colonel. And despite my reticence about peace talks, this elf prisoner might offer some way of deciphering why the world was evidently going mad. Rather than remain at the apartment to peruse the folder in my bitter mood, I grabbed my pack and headed out the door. I figured I could kill 3 birds with 1 stone if I could read the folder's contents in the laundromat on base and track down Gunther afterward. He was the officer least likely to keep up sword training now we were home, but I would leave Jennings as a last resort. It might have been vanity to continue practice with a weapon that had limited practical application in modern warfare, but there was something to the mastery of it all that compelled me to continue. The first problem with my plan was that my battered Honda's lodestone ran dry halfway to base. Having kicked the tires a couple of times when I realized there was no replacement in the trunk, I drew energy from Earth's new innate magical power supply to keep going. The effort left me feeling drained by the time I rolled into the compound. Parking near the lodestone dispensary, I lugged my pack across the grounds toward the nearby barracks where laundromats were located. Once I'd pushed my clothes into the washer and settled on a bench across from the machines, I finally opened the folder. I hoped vainly that it contained better answers than what Mrs. Lee had brushed off as a new normal. The contents of the folder were not enlightening. They identified the prisoner by number in the absence of any ID. As I paged through records and what was known of the elven colony in Encino, I became increasingly glum about my assignment. He was held on base in a fortified facility, custom-built for inter-realm prisoners of war. He'd been interrogated 5 times to no effect, with use of magical manipulation and stressors applied with approval of Colonel Levine. The records were clear in one aspect, though. The military wanted to know who this guy was and how he was connected to the peace talks. I leaned my head back against the wall, staring at the laundromat's flickering fluorescent lights. The hum of the washing machines filled my ears, but it couldn't drown out the thoughts swirling in my mind. For the past 15 years, I'd been fighting elves. It seemed like every time we turned around, there was another incursion, another skirmish, another battle. And now, here I was, being tasked with interrogating an elven prisoner in the hopes of what? Facilitating peace talks? The very idea made my stomach churn. I didn't want peace with the elves. I wanted them gone. along with every other magical race that had come through those damned gates. What I really wanted was for the world to go back to the way it was before, back when magic was nothing more than a fairy tale and the only wars we worried about were the ones we started ourselves. But that wasn't the reality I lived in anymore. Magic was here, and it seemed like it was here to stay. The thought terrified me more than anything else. An existence where magic was the norm, where elves and dwarves and gnomes walked among us. It was a world I didn't want to live in. And yet, here I was, being asked to play a part in making that world a reality. By interrogating this prisoner, was I helping to close the gates once and for all? Or was I just paving the way for these peace talks to succeed, for magic to become a permanent fixture in our lives? It wasn't like I had much choice either way, I reasoned, and reminded myself to have faith in Levine, who I knew shared my sentiments on the matter. The reports from the shrink were where things became more interesting, if still unhelpful. Adjectives such as recalcitrant, sociopathic, and egocentric littered the page. It was clear the psychologist was at their wits' end in their effort to profile the prisoner. Absently, I wondered how accurately human behavior theory would apply to the different races. There was a note scribbled at the bottom of the page which recommended testing a moderate reward system in the long term to give the prisoner a sense of agency within their confines. It also asserted that conventional torture was unlikely to be a reliable means to exact information given the previous results. I closed the folder in distaste. Elves were the enemy, sure, but facing off across the battlefield was different to poking at a lab rat with cold indifference. Maybe it was another reason I should never have wound up a soldier. I took another stab at the earlier reports which detailed the capture itself, while waiting the last few minutes for the dryer to finish its cycle. The prisoner took down 4 patrolling officers before being apprehended, which wasn't surprising. But the details were lacking on how they managed to cuff him in magical restraints. It was something I was sure the colonel hadn't missed, and made a mental note to ask him about it later. The elf was then transported across the border for delivery at Fort Hood as per protocol. With my laundry done, I folded it into a bundle and left the laundromat to see if the Lodestone dispensary was done refitting my vehicle. I wasn't sure what to make of my new assignment, or how I might approach the first interview. But if I didn't present myself to the warden soon, the colonel would be chasing me down before too long. With a sigh, I resigned myself to meeting with the recalcitrant sociopath, just as soon as I located Gunther and set up a sparring session. I figured I'd need to wave around something sharp and pointy after meeting with the elf. Chapter 3. The warden met me when I arrived at the facility. From his bald head and lined face, Warden McDaniel was of an age where he might have served before the gates opened, but that was never a given. It was his upright presence, pristine uniform, and natural authoritative voice which made me think he'd been a military man for his entire career. "Lopez," he said in a friendly bark as he checked his wristwatch. "I thought maybe there'd been a misunderstanding about expecting you today." I kept my face neutral and pulled the manila folder from my pack. "No, sir. I've been off-world, so I took a few hours to read the briefing." "The Azogrim crew, huh?" McDaniel eyed my pack, in particular the sword-shaped protrusion from the top of it. "Well, I suppose that gives you something to talk to Legolas about to break the ice." "Legolas?" I quirked an eyebrow. McDaniel spread his hands and shook his head, causing his jowls to wobble. "That SOB won't give us a name, and calling him by number never sat right with me. Come on through to my office so I can catch you up on the particulars." I nodded and followed, not voicing my thoughts on whether dubbing the prisoner with a Tolkien-esque name was any better than referring to him by number. The facility was suitably stark as McDaniel led me through secured doors and concrete hallways. In a world which had been steadily declining over the past decade, new buildings were a rarity. And while it wasn't exactly aesthetically pleasing, the whole place thrummed with magic. I'd never had cause to enter the building, which sat a good distance away from the compound. But I'd heard that guard duty was boring and poorly paid, considering the relative danger of dealing with hostile magical beings. executions of non-human POWs were commonplace, though I knew from Ambassador Benson that the practice would now cease in the case of dwarves, while both sides were holding up their end of the New Deal. I must say I'm not used to having so many visitors come by, so excuse my desk, McDaniel said as he ushered me into an office with reports piled high on every flat surface. Take a seat. I slid my pack under the chair and did as he requested. I'm guessing the most noteworthy prisoner in recent history requires a lot of paperwork. McDaniel chortled. That it does. Can I get you anything? No, sir. I'm fine. I patted the manila folder on my lap. But I would appreciate anything you can do to elaborate on the situation. Of course, Legolas is in the East Wing in solitary, with a whole unit of guards watching his every movement. A real pain in the ass, considering we have an entire facility to run. McDaniel sat with a faint scowl. He's kept in magic-canceling manacles at all times, and we like to keep him in relatively confined spaces. I'm guessing you've seen elves in action? I nodded. A flash of memory of elven soldiers vaulting barricades at the gate making me shift in my seat. They were long, lean acrobats, with speed which made tracking them with blasters an uphill battle even when there was no magic involved. He hasn't caused any casualties yet, but mainly because he hasn't tried. Don't think for a minute that he's less capable than your average elf because he's in cuffs. He's a wily one. I can tell from his eyes. McDaniel shuddered as he retrieved a slim band from his desk and passed it over. I accepted it with a questioning look. A distress beacon. You'll have the guards watching at all times, of course, but you press that, and the manacles will restrain him forcibly. Try to keep it under your sleeve where he can't see it. I rolled up my sleeve and clipped it on. What am I permitted to take in with me? The less, the better. McDaniel rubbed his bald pate and gave me a dubious look. You'll be searched before you go in. But I expect you'll need something if you're here to try and learn his god-forsaken language. We don't allow pen and paper, but something to record the interview is fine so long as you keep it out of reach, and it can't be smashed into something sharp that he can end you with. I bristled a little at the warden's tone. I was a soldier, not an idiot, but smiled, regardless. Thanks for the tip. Anything else I need to know? McDaniel stood and sniffed, looking a touch uncomfortable. Yeah. We've been sending blood samples off regular, but those scientists still can't give us a definitive answer. I requested a male AFO for this job only because I suspect what's been theorized is true. Yes? I cocked my head. We almost transferred Hancock out of the unit, a female guard who seemed affected by his presence, if you know what I mean. I'm not sure I do. I folded my arms. Pheromones, he whispered. Glamour, whatever you want to call it. First few days after he arrived, Hancock wasn't herself, if you get my meaning. She seems to have knocked it out of her head since then, otherwise I would have rostered her elsewhere. Hell, I wanted to anyhow, but the shrink in charge wants to keep the circle around Legolas close. I screwed up my face, unwilling to believe something so crass. He's in snuff cuffs, I said flatly. Which is why I say it ain't any glamour, but something in the blood itself. McDaniel lifted his chin defensively. It'll get proved in time. I rubbed my eye to give myself a moment's reprieve from his challenging stare. I'll keep that in mind. Do you think I can go take a look now? McDaniel's gaze penetrated me for a moment, as though weighing whether I was taking him seriously, before he picked up a phone and barked orders for a guard to come and collect me. Super sexy despo wasn't mentioned in any of the paperwork, so I wasn't concerned, but I wondered whether the shrink who'd profiled Legolas was a guy in retrospect. I was summarily collected by an officer by the name of Collins, who looked me up and down with a smirk before showing me through the facility. He rattled off a bunch of protocols as we went through armed doors, which I listened to with half an ear. So you're the one they sent to interrogate our elf bastard, huh? Collins remarked, his tone dripping with amusement. Good luck with that. He's been tight-lipped since we brought him in. I raised an eyebrow at him. I've dealt with plenty of elves before. I'm sure I can handle this one. Collins chuckled. We'll see about that. The shrink is with him now, so you'll have to wait until they're done. Understood, I said as we reached the guardhouse. Any tips on getting him to talk? He'll talk just fine. Getting him to answer a simple question is another matter. Collins left me to wait in the guardhouse, for which I was glad. The guy's dismissiveness was abrasive, and the way he looked at me set my teeth on edge. There was nobody else in the guardhouse, the other officers presumably watching over the current interview. So I took a seat and started jotting the required information, my mind already strategizing on how to approach the prisoner. It wasn't like I was concerned about losing my composure like some dog in heat, which McDaniel had implied, but I wasn't much of a conversationalist. And if I wanted something from a recalcitrant individual, the only way I was likely to get it was with the carrot, or the stick. If the interrogation reports were anything to go by, the stick wasn't going to work. But what could I possibly offer the elf inside a maximum security prison that would be worth trading for? In my pensive state, it didn't feel like much time had gone by when the door opened and Collins reappeared. Your turn, he said, his eyes once again raking over me with a mocking twist to his lips. If I didn't have to work with the guy for the next 3 months, I would have knocked that smug expression off his face. Grabbing the translation device from my pack, I followed Collins out. A female guard with a blonde ponytail, Hancock maybe, accompanied a guy in a shirt and tie coming in the opposite direction, who tugged at my sleeve as I went to sidle past him. You're the linguist AFO? He asked. Nothing so formal. I looked pointedly at where his hand rested on my arm. He drew it back and adjusted his glasses. My name is Dr. Shaw. I wasn't aware of your assignment until today. Please, come and see me at my office before you schedule your next interview. It would be useful to use a shared approach and compare notes. Dr. Shaw pressed a card into my palm, which I thrust into my pocket with a nod, unsure if his station meant that was an order or request. I'd need to clear it with the colonel before dropping in, but I imagined Levine would think it appropriate that we work together. We'll be in touch. I nodded to Dr. Shaw and turned to follow Collins. The tight set of the guard's jaw made his annoyance about my brief exchange with the doctor clear. When we stopped outside a fortified door, I was surprised when the guard lifted his hand to wave around my body like a scanner. I'd assumed the guy was only an operator, humans with the ability to use magical items and not to wield magic in their own right. But I guessed it made sense to have some adepts on this particular job. I wondered vaguely whether he'd always been a prison guard, or if he'd served on the front line. When Collins stopped at my hip, he frowned. Translator? I patted my pocket and nodded. I put it on the log sheet. Suit yourself. He shrugged and held a palm to a flat disc next to the door. The door buzzed and swung open, revealing the prisoner for the first time. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My first glimpse of the elf was not what I'd imagined. Instead of the color-shifting fatigues I was accustomed to, he wore a garish orange jumpsuit. It made sense, of course. His magical attire would have been confiscated. But the sight was jarring, almost absurd. He sat cuffed to the table, his piercing gaze meeting mine with a look of utter boredom. In that moment, the world seemed to still. Then Collins stepped through, breaking the spell. I forced myself to focus, taking in the stark confines of the 9x9 room. Harsh fluorescent light illuminated every corner, glinting off the table bolted to the floor. 2 molded plastic chairs flanked it on either side. Clearing my throat, I stepped across the threshold. The door snapped shut behind me with an ominous finality. I lowered myself onto the vacant seat across from the elf. Our eyes met again, and I saw past the facade of boredom to the contempt simmering underneath. Under the unforgiving light, his emerald irises seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly iridescence. They were angled slightly, almost feline in their shape. That close, I noticed his white blonde hair carried a faint green tinge. I wondered absently if I'd skimmed over the same quality among elven casualties on the battlefield. It took a second for me to fish out the translation device from my pocket. As I did, Collins reached for the pinned chain between the prisoner's manacles and gave it a shake. A bit of juice to these will keep him from getting too smart. Collins's lip curled as he gave me a demonstration, causing the prisoner to go rigid and shake. Touching them isn't necessary, but sometimes you'll need to use extra force. Don't worry, it isn't possible to go too far with it from what we've been told. My eyes widened as I watched the elf go from shaking to convulsing. Before I could process my own reaction, I flew from my seat, slamming a hand on the table. Enough. Get your hands off those cuffs, officer. I was taken aback by the vehemence in my own voice. This was an elf. The enemy. Why did I feel such a visceral reaction to his mistreatment? Collins only arched an eyebrow and lifted his chin as he stepped back. It's protocol. Pushing aside my inner turmoil, I resorted to the only thing the army understood: dominance. While I'm in this room, this is my prisoner. I lifted my finger to point at the elf and glared at Collins. And you won't touch him unless I give you orders to do so. Got it? Collins huffed and made as if to argue, but I cut him off. That'll be all, officer. I'll buzz the door when I'm done here. Listen, I don't know what kind of delegation you think you have, but here we only answer to the warden, and he says... I don't give a shit what he says, I sneered. He answers to Colonel Levine, same as me. That'll be all, officer. Collins stared me down for a couple of seconds before giving me a mulish look and sidling past the prisoner, bumping his shoulder on the way past. The elf's lip twitched, and if looks could burn, Collins would have had 2 holes in the back of his head as he left through the armed door. Once it snapped shut, I took a steadying breath, trying to regain my equilibrium. Then I depressed the switch on the translation device. Sorry about that, I said telepathically through the translation device, my mind still reeling from my unexpected outburst. Then I cringed internally about my hasty apology. What was wrong with me? I couldn't let this throw me off balance. I had a job to do. My name is Asha Lopez. Your methods are crude, he said, surprising me by responding vocally. He shook his manacled wrists in a lightning-fast gesture and sneered. And your magical devices are barbaric. I didn't flinch. Sharp movements didn't do much to send me into terror in my line of work, but I still sat dumb at the revelation that the elf spoke to me in plain English. After hitting the switch of the translation device again, I folded my hands in my lap. You speak English, I said, wondering what else I'd missed in the reports back in the laundromat. That's no mean feat in 6 weeks. One does not venture to other worlds without first becoming proficient in their languages. I smirked, and his challenging stare grew darker. Entonces, yo supongo que eres competente en otros idiomas terrestres? I cocked my head. Sí, he grunted. I pouted and gave an appreciative nod. Too easy, though. If his intended destination was in Mexico, it made sense he was fluent in Spanish, too. I steepled my fingers and leaned forward. Êtes-vous sûr de cela? Je ne suis pas trompeur, moindre être, he answered in perfectly accented French. Lesser being, I said dryly. I didn't realize we were already trading insults. Hell, I don't even know your name yet. The elf set his jaw, his eyes glinting like I'd just insulted his mother. I waited for him to continue in his language of choice, but he only leaned back with a surly look. It took me a second to realize my error. I'm not here to learn your true identity. Frankly, I don't give a damn why you're here or what you were planning to do once you got to the Encino colony. I've been given a special assignment that you're qualified to assist me with, and I refuse to call you prisoner or Legolas while we work together. Don't even get me started about referring to you by number. I'll let you decide what you'd like me to call you. He gave me a flat stare as if I was babbling. Heck, maybe I was. And I could tell even before he opened his mouth he would not provide a suitable answer. I don't work with humans. He enunciated every syllable with disgust. Really? Your schedule too busy? With all the solitary confinement, shrink appointments, and I leaned in and whispered, "Did I hear something about blood samples? That must really take it out of a guy like you. And don't get me started on the meals. It must take hours to digest the stuff they serve up in here. If it's anything like the mess hall, I will not render assistance to the enemy." So this was turning out great. Despite every intention of trying the carrot approach when stepping into the room, I'd used the first 5 minutes to resort to snark and sarcasm. My mother always told me that sarcasm was the lowest form of humor. The elf was in a hostile environment, and even for a tough guy, his captivity on a strange world had to be more than a little alarming. "The word is, we might not be enemies for too much longer," I said, knowing that the subject of peace talks had already been aired with the prisoner from the reports, but planning to be coy on the subject. "I'm not sure if you got the memo before arriving here, but your leaders reached out to schedule peace talks in a few months." His expression gave nothing away as he stared back at me across the table. It was a poker face my gambling comrades would have killed for. And yet, he spread his hands as far as the manacles allowed, and the corners of his mouth turned upward. I got the feeling the facial muscles responsible for smiling were among the least exercised in his whole body, and my mouth twisted at the notion. Elves are capable of sarcasm? Who knew? But you might want to hear about my assignment before you turn me down. What was it you said before about being proficient in languages before heading to an unfamiliar world? What I want is simple. I'm here to learn Elvish. I wasn't expecting him to laugh. Heartily. But I only waited until he'd subsided, convinced the proposition couldn't be that entertaining. When his features settled into a mocking grin, I cocked my head in irritation. "And tell me, why would I grant you this boon, Asha Lopez?" I refrained from biting my lip and kept my features deadpan. "Because I've been ordered to visit you here daily until I'm fluent in Elvish, and I figure you could use someone to talk to who isn't trying to get inside your head like the shrink." I leaned back in my seat, not wanting to appear eager. "Besides, I've been told I make for excellent company." The prisoner snorted derisively, but a touch of amusement remained on his lips. He didn't appear in any hurry to respond, and I wondered if I'd misstepped. "Lord," he said after a few moments. I blinked. "Beg your pardon?" "You wished to know what you should call me. You may refer to me as Lord." Eager to hear what comes next? The link to the full audiobook of The Elf Captive is right in the description. Check it out today. Happy listening.